in as needed.
Okay.
So do you want to start with the spiel?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Good evening, everyone. I have a few housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting, assuming Kurt is ready.
Oh yeah, we're good.
This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn off your video. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send me a chat. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. And I'll turn it back over the meeting to you, Chair.
All right, well, welcome everybody, both here and online, to the December edition of the Multimodal Transportation Commission's monthly meeting, starting as always with our study session at 5 o'clock. So, for this particular study session, we have Evan Correnta, is that how you say last name? Okay. I was gonna say, I thought I heard it a couple years ago, but it's been a while since I've seen you, so. Who's gonna be discussing the draft of our ADA transition plan for the public right-of-way specifically, so. So we got slides, and you can just kind of take it away whenever.
Let me, there you go. That'll guide you through.
All right. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Evan Correnta, and I'm the city's ADA Compliance Administrator. And today, we're going to be talking about our work that we've been doing with our ADA transition plan for our public right-of-way. A little bit about ADA transition plans. All municipalities that have over 50-plus employees are required to have plans in place that take a look at all facilities or infrastructure that can affect people with disabilities, and any barriers that they find present in their evaluation process. They're to create a plan to get those items into compliance, or at least reduce the barriers to not prevent participation. So just a little background, we passed the facilities ADA transition plan. The city commission adopted that in March of 2022. So this will be the next one that we'll be bringing to them, still kind of in draft form, but we hope to at least get kind of initial feedback here in the next couple of months. So the ADA transition plan really consists of first, a self-evaluation where we take a look at all of our existing pedestrian routes, so that'd be sidewalks, shared use paths, curb ramps, and really take a look to see what deficiencies we may have, what's currently not accessible, ways we can make improvements to eliminate some of those access barriers. And really that's done through kind of a thorough evaluation process where we actually are using technology to go out and take a look at our current inventory, and then really try to figure out a dollar amount and what it's going to take to get that into compliance. So some of the challenges specifically here, in Lawrence, is we have about 400 plus miles of sidewalk and shared use paths, and about 6,400 ADA curb ramps currently. Most of these at current standard fall below kind of the ADA standards or even the city standards that we have in place. One of the other big challenges that we have is the lack of a current sidewalk brick policy. That process is underway, but obviously that can put a huge variable when we're looking at kind of city infrastructure and cost and things like that. So that's one of the things that we'll be working through kind of in the upcoming months as well. So here is just kind of a snapshot of the dashboard and some of the information that we got from our LiDAR technology when we went out. As you can see, so some of the stuff that's ADA compliant is the very, very dark green, which represents about 27% of our sidewalk or shared use paths. And the rest either falls kind of below that, non-ADA compliant or has issues or needs kind of minor repairs. So, we're looking at, probably over 70% still needs some work, whether that's full replacement, spot repairs, or things like that. So this is just kind of a snapshot and what we'll be using as we move forward to kind of put our pricing to, and kind of as we look at blocks that may need full replacement versus spot repair, and kind of how we use that during our evaluation process. So some of our current strategies that we're using to reduce pedestrian barriers in our sidewalk networks. So when we're looking at our existing sidewalks and ramps, we have, of course, the Sidewalk Improvement Program, which really is designed to eliminate trip hazards. It's not really for full ADA compliance. A lot of times they're able to achieve ADA compliance by removing those trip hazards and barriers, but really that's not the goal of that program, and the funding behind that really can't afford to do block end to block end repair for ADA compliance currently. We also have the standalone ADA reconstruction project. So if there was a project in place that was a standalone CIP project that was addressing kind of sidewalk infrastructure, private development or redevelopment, sidewalk repair or construction, and then the sidewalk construction is part of a roadway project. So sometimes through the scope of work, if it's large enough, in its scope, it will actually touch kind of adjacent sidewalks and ask you to bring kind of adjacent sidewalks and curb ramps up to accessible standards as well. Now, some of the issues with sidewalk gaps over to the right. Now, the ADA transition plan for right-of-way will only address existing infrastructure. So it's not looking at gaps, missing sidewalks, things like that. The addition of sidewalks is actually not a requirement of the ADA. It's just where you have sidewalks, they have to meet ADA. So we have a couple different programs in place that will help us address that gap. So new sidewalks is part of a roadway reconstruction project, so where they are extending something and they're adding it as part of a new development or new construction project. Private development or redevelopment, they may ask for the addition of sidewalks in those areas to kind of complete that sidewalk pedestrian network. We have the five-year bike ped plan, specific capital improvement projects that may go out there to address specific gap issues, and then the Lawrence pedestrian plan, which has actually a pretty robust sidewalk gap network in there where they kind of plan to tackle in their methodology on where they'll go and how they address kind of sidewalk gap issues. So our prioritization methodology, so this is very similar to kind of what the sidewalk improvement program uses, some of our other sidewalk improvement programs, as well as the Lawrence pedestrian plans. So as we're looking at kind of sidewalks that we really hope to target first, in our first handful of years as we're doing our ADA transition plan, we'll obviously look at areas that are serving schools, public transit, points of interest, public attractions, obviously government facilities, hospitals, things like that. But then we're also going to take a look at populations that have transportation disadvantages, so folks that we know, areas in town that have a higher density of folks with disabilities, lower education, income. So all those kind of things are used in our prioritization methodology that we'll use to kind of select where we'll be going first in our ADA transition plan. So the current investment and future cost projections for our right-of-way transition plan. So here's kind of a snapshot. In 2022, through our capital improvement investment, we spent about $1.29 million in sidewalk to make them ADA compliant. So that was our total investment in 2022. We're kind of projecting years 2024 through 2028 about $1.92 million annually in sidewalk and shared use paths, as well as curb ramps. So when we look at our total amount of funding needed over the next, we're hopefully thinking that we can get this done in the next 20 years. We're about $76 million for just sidewalks and shared use paths, and about another $11.7 million for ADA curb ramps, which would bring that up to about $8.7 million total. So if we're looking at the funding gap there, let's say we did the 20-year plan, we would be, So as you can see there, if we did like a 20-year plan, we would still have an anticipated funding gap of about $2.45 million a year. So what we would like to do, and one of the things that we'll obviously be bringing in front of the commission kind of for their feedback is, one, trying to not only figure out, what kind of timeline are you comfortable with? Are you comfortable with doing, a 15-year plan? If you do that, it's obviously going to be a higher annual investment. Or did you want to stretch it out longer? We kind of feel as a staff that the sweet spot is probably 20 years, but obviously that's going to be kind of up to the commission on what they feel, if they want to stretch it out a little bit further. The problem with, doing something like a 30-year plan and stretching it out that far is by the time you get to 30 years of a plan, a lot of the infrastructure that you tackled in years 1 through 5 or whatever, you may have additional maintenance costs to kind of maintain those and keep those into compliance. So that's kind of some of the funding gaps that we're looking at right now and how we plan to move forward. Some funding opportunities to meet these identified gaps. So like I'd mentioned, standalone projects. So there may be CIP projects that are specific to sidewalks. So they're going into an area and that's just part of a standalone CIP project where they're doing ADA reconstruction or block end to block end, or it's part of a larger street maintenance project. Grants, obviously we'll continue to look for any type of federal infrastructure grants, local grants, state grants, anything we can find really. Neighborhood redevelopment, obviously there would be an opportunity here if a neighborhood was doing a large-scale redevelopment, they would be required in that process to bring their current infrastructure up to ADA standards. And then projects for roadway alterations, again, this would be kind of a really large project if we were extending a roadway, and kind of within that scope of work, we were also, doing stuff with adjacent sidewalks or shared use paths. So some of the public participation that we've done throughout the years, we had the 2023 Sidewalk Improvement Plan, which was done on the Lawrence Listen Survey, a 2020 citywide accessibility study that we did kind of when we were starting both of the work on our transition plans, just to kind of gauge, what were the top priorities for folks in our community. The 2022 Lawrence Pedestrian Plan, the Safe Routes to School 2023 to 24 revised routes, and the 2022 Bus Stop Amenities Plan. So these plans were actually specifically targeting kind of right-of-way infrastructure questions and getting feedback on not only what folks thought of our sidewalks and shared use paths, but how we should pay for it, what that strategy should be. And on top of kind of the comments that we've gotten on these specific surveys, it seems like almost every survey we put out, regardless of what the topic is, sidewalks is kind of something that gets brought up, or sidewalk infrastructure either, not being in great repair or, things like that. So I think we've got a lot of good feedback on kind of how our community feels about our sidewalks, and, and that really helps guide us moving forward. So next steps, as I mentioned, we will be going to the City Commission in the next couple months as more of a work session, really try to, nothing to get adopted at that time, but just to kind of bring some of this information to them as far as what we're looking at for total funding, kind of what our funding gaps would be, timelines, and then how they think we should do this. Obviously, as I mentioned, we've discussed as a staff doing this as potentially an annual CIP program. So we would have annual dedicated funding for the ADA right-of-way transition plan program that would tackle this. And we think that, given the nature of sidewalk infrastructure and the community feedback, and as well as our strategic plan, we think that a plan like this would score, pretty high, when we're comparing it against kind of other programs and projects throughout the community. I guess that's it.
Cool.
Thank you. And then any questions anybody has, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah. Well, since this is a study session, I'm hoping that we can come up with a fairly good discussion to, learn more about anything that was maybe unclear or more curious about, or just provide feedback. So I'm going to open up to others first to see any general questions, thoughts, and then I got a whole bunch of notes I've been taking down. So.
You mentioned that on the 30-year funding cycle, that if you get to the end, you'd have to just do it again. So I'm curious, if we were to build a sidewalk using modern construction techniques, how long does a sidewalk last?
That's a great question. There's some varying opinions on that. And Jake may have some suggestions on that too, but what our asset management team and kind of what the practical world really is probably a little bit different. Jake, maybe you have a little bit better idea of kind of life cycles of a brand new sidewalk.
Yeah, it's not an exact science. You could say 30 years, you could say 80 years. I mean, we do have sidewalk in this town that's in great shape, that's been built a long time ago. The answer's somewhere in the middle. I can't remember what Darren's
I
asset
think they
management
did
group
80
used.
years on the asset management stuff. So.
Wow.
Must be for a treeless street.
Yeah.
I have a feeling trees are the big issue.
Trees and also difference in concrete, you know, that's changed a lot over.
Right, mixed designs have
the years.
changed
Yeah,
over the
materials,
years.
yeah.
Right, trees are obviously probably one of the biggest nemesis we have.
And I think one of the important things is when we're looking at sidewalks is even after the completion, you know, let's say it's 20 years, and after we complete our 20 years, it's not like we stop there. You know, the thought of actually having a fully compliant, you know, city is pretty unlikely. It'll always take kind of routine maintenance, upkeep, and there's going to be some areas where we're going to have to go back and just do, you know, hopefully spot repairs though, and not kind of full block end replacement like we're starting at from the beginning. And it could be more of a, you know, fixing a crack here, a panel there, heave a tree, something like that, where we're not doing kind of full block end with curb ramps and things like that. So, but there will be kind of an investment annually, even after the completion of, let's say, 20 years. I think they had built in like a $350,000 ongoing, just as kind of a routine maintenance to kind of keep infrastructure up to, you know, kind of the standard that it was built to.
And what has lasted better, the brick or modern concrete?
Well, you know, it depends.
Clear answer.
It
No,
depends.
this is cool.
It depends. There's a lot of communities that are still keeping brick because it's, you know, because of the look or historic, but they're doing it a little bit differently. They're laying concrete first, then putting a sand base, and then putting
Yeah.
brick. So what I mean, it's lasting a lot longer because it was built on a concrete base. You know, if you're putting down brick just in, you know, like they did in the old days with nothing underneath it, you'll see it kind of disappears into nothing after a while. So, you know, I don't know if one's any better than the other, but I can tell you that, you know, keeping brick is gonna make the cost go up.
Here in town particularly, your brick sidewalks are in the older established neighborhoods, so you have that tree probably even more, I think, than you have in the newer developed parts of town.
No, Baldwin City on their brick sidewalks is doing that application that you're describing with concrete base and then building it up with the sand. So, I mean, but obviously the ones in East Lawrence are in disarray, and I can't imagine, I mean, they're not ADA compliant, right? So, but there's a tension with Historic Commission, and so how do we resolve that? I mean, ADA is federal, right? Law, so.
The answer is working through the brick policy. So we've been talking about a brick street and sidewalk policy for a long time.
Yeah.
And so the answer is going to happen there through a community engagement effort.
And really, that's gonna come, you know, when we bring this forward to the commission, we're gonna need some feedback on that as well, and kind of, you know, are we keeping brick wherever brick was currently, even if it's not in a historic district? I mean, there's a lot of areas that have brick sidewalks that it's not historic, or we're not in a historic environment, but it's just there. So, you know, what's the policy there is, you know, okay, so maybe we, you know, we'll lay the concrete in the sand base, but if the adjacent property owner wants the brick, it's at their cost. I mean, there's some of these things that, you know, we're working through. When I was looking at some of the brick policy that other communities have done is, a lot of them are actually getting rid of brick in general, and they're actually putting down a concrete and doing a brick pattern, like a stamped pattern, and then they color it. You know, so that's an option too. I mean, if people, I mean, it gives the look, but it's obviously not brick, so I mean, it doesn't have some of the history there. So that's options. But it's just, you know, some of that is still, that is a huge variable on kind of, you know, this plan. And, because, I mean, if the brick policy says everywhere where there's currently brick must remain, then, I mean, that could eat into a lot of the funding, and, you know, but that's some of the direction that we'll get from our community and the commission, really.
What's the status of the brick policy? I mean, where is it in
Underway.
the works? Not started, or?
It has not started. You know, we started it a couple of years ago, and we got hung up with staff turnover and other priorities, and it hasn't taken off since then.
Okay.
We are staffed up, and I think we're kind of making a commitment to get started on that again soon.
Okay.
And I would say it's getting a little bit closer, because last week or 2 weeks ago, I was asked to kind of start reviewing some brick policy of other sides. So I think that it's moving in that direction in anticipation for when the brick policy or brick committee kind of gets formed.
You got it.
I apologize if you've already addressed this earlier before I came in, but I had heard once on city commission that the funding, like, the way the not the physical infrastructure, but the infrastructure for funding sidewalks in the city is like not through the CIP. Is that accurate or not? Like that maybe adjacent property owners were paying for something or no?
So sidewalks are funded, Evan touched on it in some of his slides, but our maintenance projects don't show up in the capital improvement plan with the exception of the street maintenance projects. So like the sidewalk improvement program is in the MSO's operating budget. So we have kind of itemizations within our operating budget for certain things, for alley improvement, for sidewalk ramps, for sidewalk repair. Now, the city's policy is that the adjacent property owner is responsible for repairs. So the way that program works is we pay for the repairs up front and then invoice property owners. So some of that money comes back in.
Is it if a property owner makes a complaint that you guys do that repair, or you're proactively doing that and then invoicing afterwards?
Both. So with the sidewalk improvement program, we started off focusing on areas of town, and then we threw that out and said, no, let's focus on priority pedestrian routes. So that's what we've been doing the last 3 years. So, we went from route selection instead of area selection. So that is the proactive approach, but we also have some, I would call it kind of urgent repair money, where if we do get complaints all the time and we track those and we group them together, and we've got a little bit of money each year to go after and repair those. So, we're trying to kind of meet everybody's needs throughout the year.
And that's one of the things that we're actually need some feedback from the city commission on too, because we're, we've thought about a couple different things, whether the ADA transition plan just absorbs kind of the sidewalk improvement program funds, and that's run kind of as part of this ADA transition fund now that doesn't require kind of adjacent property owners to pay a portion for their sidewalk. When we're looking at the ADA transition plan, this is kind of a holistic, this is what we're proposing as the city kind of doing 100% of that work of adjacent properties. But again, there was some political push for the sidewalk improvement program, and kind of, so whether that they want that to stay and run its course first, or kind of how that, or whether that funding rolls over into this ADA transition plan, that's, we're kind of yet to be determined.
I guess I would just follow that up, because I think getting to the root of your question is the funding for the ADA transition plan will be in the capital improvement plan. It will compete with other projects for that limited pool of funds.
So it'll be separate from the MSO's line item?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
This will be new funding through the CIP.
Got it.
I was going to ask something about that. I'm still not sure I quite understand it. It seems like there's kind of a Venn diagram here. So I understand that anything that's new sidewalks, like sidewalk gaps, is definitely not in the ADA transition plan. That's something else. That's safe routes to school, sidewalk gap programs, stuff like that. But existing sidewalks is covered under both the city sidewalk repair program and also the ADA transition plan. And I'm trying to figure out where the Venn diagram meshes up here exactly, why they're different. Because both are addressing cracks and trip hazards and bad ramps in the sidewalk. I don't know if I'm just misunderstanding how this all works, though.
Okay, if we back up a couple of years, when we went to our priority pedestrian routes, we inspected blocks of sidewalk and realized some of them are too bad to do spot repairs on.
Right, like the
So-
whole block basically had to be done?
Yeah, so basically we're
Okay.
separating every block of sidewalk into one of two categories. Hey, we can do spot repairs on this, replace a panel here and there, and make it passable. Not ADA compliant, passable.
Okay,
The rest of those we categorize as replacement. That's the one that
Okay.
we're gonna completely tear out and reconstruct to be ADA. Now, with the ADA transition plan, at some point, we're gonna come back to those routes that we did spot repairs on because they're still not compliant and have to reconstruct those.
They're not full ADA compliant. They may be safe, they may be usable for people with disabilities, but they don't meet true ADA, like block end to block end. I mean, there could be some, we fix trip hazards and cracks and things like that. And I just want to mention too, so the sidewalk improvement program, when it was envisioned, it was really kind of a first step in kind of addressing some of our sidewalk infrastructure. And at a minimum, with the funding we had available, at least fixing kind of trip hazards or major safety concerns, where the ADA transition plan is kind of a whole separate thing where we are looking at kind of how do we make it as ADA compliant as possible, kind of with the funding we have and the maximum extent feasible. I mean, there are going to be areas in town that will never get 100% ADA compliant. They may be chasing grade on a hill or street slope. I mean, so we'll never get it, but at least get it as close to ADA as possible.
so with the sidewalk improvement plan and those projects that are too big for just a spot thing, like they need entire streets or entire block faces redone, they eliminate trip hazards, but then are fully ADA compliant. So I guess the first question is, what other hazards am I not understanding might need to be done? Because I don't know a lot about the field at all. Like, what beyond trip hazards is something that would be done with the next level of funding?
Okay, so your question, I think, is what makes a sidewalk compliant or non-compliant?
Yeah,
So,
versus just passable.
right, yeah, so to make a sidewalk compliant, you've got to have the right width. So we've got to have
Okay.
5 foot wide sidewalks
Width,
where,
okay.
in a lot of places in town, they're 3 to 4.
Yeah.
You've got your cross slope on those as well. So again, that's where trees and settlement and water problems cause them to tip and move. So ADA is going to tell you got to be 2% or less on your cross slope.
Okay, that makes more sense then.
So those are probably the really big ones.
Yeah.
Other than that, you start getting into sidewalk ramps.
Yeah, so here, that's a really good example that Jake was talking about the width. So let's say the sidewalk improvement program went into a whole area and they fixed every spot repair, so now it's completely, usable, but, the whole thing's only 3 feet wide.
Yeah.
So this ADA transition plan would go back and be like, at some point, we're making this 5 feet wide now, and it's gonna be 2% cross slope, it's gonna have no more of a 5% running slope, we're gonna have accessible curb ramps on each end. So, kind of taking a more holistic approach as we're looking at these sidewalks versus just kind of eliminate those first barriers.
So I may be, I guess, getting too far ahead here, but it seems like if you were to spend a lot of money fixing sidewalks such that they're passable, but then later have to fix them so they're fully ADA compliant, it would obviously be best funds unlimited to do it all at once, right? Like, okay, if we're gonna fix the cracks, let's just make them wide and the right cross slope. Is there a concern that you might be fixing stuff that you then have to fix like 3 or 4 years later once funding is available for that street? I guess, what's the plan around there?
I don't
avoid
think
rework.
we've gotten that far into the weeds yet, but I mean, the hope would be that we don't do spot repairs on a street. We're gonna do complete reconstruction on within 5 years, right? We recognize the sidewalk improvement program is more of a triage. Let's make it passable. Let's make it as safe as we can. So there is gonna have to be some detailed thought in how to
Okay.
avoid those situations.
Okay, I
Because
mean,
if our horizon is 20 years, then that spot fix, maybe 15 years before they get back to,
And
Yeah.
I do, when we're looking at what areas we're gonna prioritize moving forward with our ADA transition plan. So for instance, areas of town that have already been addressed through the sidewalk improvement program, those will go towards the bottom of the list because they've actually at least been usable and, are safe for folks. So we're gonna kind of hit in years 1 through 5, kind of the areas that we've identified as kind of, for one, the areas that the sidewalk improvement program said, this area is too bad, it needs full block end to block end replacement. So we're starting that's what we hope is kind of the highest priority areas first. And we hopefully won't even get back to looking at kind of some of the areas that the sidewalk improvement program did till much, much later in the plan. And then hopefully at that point, it's still not full block end to block end, but I mean, you never know.
okay.
It's
all
my
sort of makes sense.
Sorry.
That's all right, I was just saying, it's all starting to make a lot more sense now, so.
My understanding is that accessibility design standards change occasionally. Like, it's not like ADA passed in 1990, it was 5 foot width, the design standards that you're describing. So how do we account for that future facing? We just, we're working with the accessibility design standards as they currently are, assuming that they're not going to change drastically. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so when the original ADA was passed, so the 1991 technical standards first came out. And in those first technical standards, they really only addressed facilities. So they looked at kind of building infrastructure, and they didn't really go a whole lot into the weeds on kind of right-of-way infrastructure, other than kind of they had some minimum ADA curb ramp design. When they did the 2010 standards for accessible design, they did a little bit more detail on right-of-way, but not kind of, again, it was more focused on facilities, services, and programs. And because of that, the United States Access Board actually came up with something called Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. And they were drafted in I think, 2010 or 2011. And it's actually what Federal Highway uses as kind of their standards. And most communities use, it's called PROAG, as their accessibility standards when they're designing sidewalks. And so we've actually used that as our design standard since 2013, I think, is city ordinance. So we're actually to the highest standard of accessibility. Right now, the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines have been published and they're waiting for adoption. When they're adopted, they will be mandatory, but they've been in draft status since probably 2011. However, they are still kind of best practice, and it's what almost every community, Department of Transportation, Federal Highway, it's kind of what they go by because they are just, it's the most comprehensive technical guidelines when it comes to sidewalks, curb ramps, things like that. But yes, I mean, they do change. One of the nice things is there is something called a safe harbor provision. So let's say that we do everything to ProAg standards and all of our sidewalks are great, and then in the year 2025, they come out with this new accessibility guidelines. If your current infrastructure at least meets the original ProAg, you have a safe harbor provision. That means you don't have to rip it up and redo it, but if something were to happen, they cracked and it needed to be block end to block end, you would have to do it to the newest current standard. So, yeah. So we have, right now, we have some curb ramps in town that were designed to the 1991 technical standards, which, as long as they're in good repair, they still meet ADA because they have a safe harbor provision as long as they weren't, too badly damaged or anything like that. They still have, they meet the slope, the cross slope, things like that. So.
So that kind of brings up another question I had. You mentioned like having to adhere to a certain standard. So I was wondering, what are the sort of carrots and sticks here from the feds in terms of, okay, we know that we have to have an ADA transition plan because we have more than 50 employees, is that right? But what is there a timeline? It seems like not necessarily. I mean, because you put anything from 5 to 30 or so.
Yeah.
What do the feds require?
So the feds require a plan.
Okay.
A plan and then an end date to address that plan,
Okay.
depending on kind of what this, now, it varies from community to community, size to size. I can tell you that, so the Department of Justice, if they were to ever come into a city or a community based on kind of a high level of complaints or something like that, recently it happened in Kansas City, Missouri in the late, I think it was like 2017, they had a Department of Justice settlement agreement where they had a backlog of complaints with sidewalk infrastructure. And the Department of Justice actually came in and said, you have to do it in this timeline, and that's it. So keeping the Department of Justice out of your town is good because they speed up the timeline exponentially, which can increase that cost. I mean, they may say it needs to be done in 7 years, which can put a community in quite the bind if they don't have that funding available. The plan is to kind of protect you, to say, hey, look, we've at least identified that we have barriers and we have a plan to kind of get towards that end goal. And Lawrence actually had an original ADA transition plan from the early 1990s that included kind of the facilities that we had at that time. And then they also had language in there about our right-of-way infrastructure. So, and in fact, some of these plans that we have, our sidewalk improvement plan, the ADA curb ramp program, those are kind of separate, smaller plans that kind of at least keep you in compliance and keep the Department of Justice, off your back, because at least you have plans in place and you're making an effort as part of your community to kind of reduce these barriers. But yeah, it's becoming more common to have these settlement agreements from the Department of Justice. Record-breaking last year, Los Angeles County, $1.1 billion. They had 30,000 miles of sidewalks, and they have 30 years to do it. So I actually was at a conference and met with the ADA coordinator from Los Angeles County, and we had a great conversation. And it can really put your community in a bind, but in some instances, it's good for some communities to kind of kick them, and say, hey, you really need to start working on this too. So, but again, it's kind of on their timeline versus your timeline, so.
Okay. I want to make sure I'm not hogging the table. I'm sure others have questions too. It's a very interesting subject. All right, well, in that case. So it seems like for the most part, we're talking about right away on the sidewalk side, and anything between the sidewalks, it doesn't seem like that's a part of the plan necessarily, but I'm curious about stuff like crosswalk distances or grade of hills for curb cuts and stuff. That probably comes up, right? In terms of having maybe driveways that make the sidewalk all wavy and kind of difficult to navigate, but crosswalks seem like they may be out of scope, like crossing distances.
Are you talking curb ramps or pedestrian push, when you say crosswalks?
So I think specifically the distance between two sidewalks to cross in some cases is really wide. And without a pedestrian refuge, it can be difficult for some to cross in the right amount of time, I suppose. So Does that come into play in the ADA transition plan, or is that not necessarily required?
No, no, I mean, that wouldn't be, I mean, you mentioned driveway, so one of the things we look at if we're doing like block into block end, so driveway slope, and how you would have to have a continuous accessible path through driveways as well.
Yeah.
So it would have to flatten out that 5-foot wide section where you cross a driveway. Now, the driveway may have to be slanted going up from there or going down to the street grade. But I mean, there are some things that we'll mention kind of in our transition plan where we talk about like signal timing and things like that as well. But as far as, I don't know about distances to crosswalks.
Well, yeah, you're talking about all the problems that happen between the curb ramps, whether it's distance or
Yeah.
cross slope, because you're up, coming down KU on 11th Street and you've
Oh,
got
I see.
a horrendous, slope down the hill.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes those problems can't be solved, or the money may be too much, so it's,
Yeah, so in this case, you're talking counter slope where you're actually having like a hill meet up with the crosswalk and create that kind of, is that what you're talking about?
I think there's maybe multiple issues, and all of them are probably important. I guess in terms of driveway cuts, we definitely talked about that one recently with the sidewalk app improvement, where I asked the question of like, why do we have to pay for so much driveway fixing? That's why.
right.
But then there's the issue of, say, trying to cross 23rd Street at Castle, for example. Like, that is a beast of an intersection. And I can't think of a good way to make that shorter. I mean, even in the best of circumstances, that is a long way to walk if you have a walking mobility of some sort. So, like, how do you deal with that, right?
I see what you're saying. So some of that stuff can be done with signal timing. So like, so obviously, so we've done out and done like timing studies where I actually went out with like Jessica Mortinger with the MPO and we actually pushed some intersections. Another one was 6th and Wakarusa. We did
Yeah,
that
big
kind
one.
of area and what we did is we kind of pushed the button and then I rolled through the intersections to see like, hey, was it adequate time? And you can actually kind of adjust timing based on, it's too technical for me, but there's all these variables on kind of how much time is allowed and what's appropriate, and you can increase them, you can decrease them, you can do kind of different things to at least kind of make the no walking or whatever sign
Yeah.
stay up longer, things like that. So, I mean, there are some things you can do there as far as the signal timing thing, and that's actually a part of another project that does like the signal timing.
Right.
And things like that. But again, yeah, I mean, that's
Okay.
a very important thing as well. Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know a lot about disabilities, honestly, but from what I've heard, it seems like there are certain almost like invisible disabilities where it seems like somebody can walk, but they can't walk very far, or not all at the same time. Like, it seems like a very difficult problem. Because then, I mean, how do you deal with the fact that it's a 6-lane wide road, right? There's only so skinny the road can be.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a challenge, it sounds like. What are your views on raised crosswalks at intersections? Do you think that would help to avoid having to go ramp down, ramp up, while also slowing cars who are going across the intersection? I think design standards indicate that you can't have speed bumps at intersections, which means that may preclude raised crosswalks. So this might be a question for both of you guys. Like, how could we make the crossing experience better?
That might be more of an MUTCD thing and a Jake thing, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer for that right now.
Okay. So like in other countries, it's pretty common to have some kind of bump up when you are going over a crosswalk rather than bringing the pedestrians and bikes down to the cars, you bring the cars up to everybody else. But yeah, if that's not allowed, I guess there's not much we can do about it, but. it's
I
always a
think it
question.
also depends on the type of road.
Right. I mean, if it's gonna be on like an
Classification.
arterial, probably not, right?
Yeah, like if you look at like the MUTCD standards and stuff, I mean, they have all the definitions on where you can put, what you can put, how
Yeah.
you can put it. I mean, so they probably have every specific kind of scenario that you could think of, and it could be, yeah, maybe we can't do it, or we don't have the space, or the distance, or the width, or, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. I guess the question from a disability advocacy standpoint is it better to not have to have a change in elevation if you can help it? Like, is it better to just go straight across rather than down and up again? I mean, say if it's raining or, it's icy outside.
I mean, I can tell you as a wheelchair user, I'd prefer to go straight.
Okay.
I mean, I would. I mean, as much as possible. I mean, anytime that you can kind of keep kind of a steady running slope or something where you're not getting a lot of ups and downs. Now, sometimes, especially when you're on grade and you're chasing grade up a hill, you may have to push kind of hard, then you
Yeah.
can have a flattened resting spot. But, so, it's called a stepped approach. I mean, so there's all these different things you can do to kind of help accessibility, but to at least kind of allow resting areas for people that are either pushing, walking, rolling, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, straight lines.
Okay, that's good to know. I feel like it's one of those perspectives that we don't hear super often, but when we discuss things like raised crosswalks, it's good to know that it's not just for slowing traffic, it's also for ease of access.
Really quick, my personal perspective is that application that you all did on Iowa and 23rd, because it narrows the right-hand turn for all of the, all of the lanes, makes it a much more, like on an arterial, a safer crossing experience. I think it's one of the best applications personally I've experienced in the city. But I don't know, from a wheelchair user perspective, how that feels going across that distance there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that anytime you're in a busy area crossing any street, there's always, it's always a little bit scary. I mean, whether you're a wheelchair user, somebody with low vision or something like that, I mean, it's always, whether or not somebody's gonna stop or pull too far ahead in the, crosswalk. I mean, there's a lot of times where I'm crossing, even residential streets where people have pulled out too far and I'm kind of either having to weave around their car or whatever. I mean, so, yeah, crosswalks are always a little bit scarier, and the busier an intersection, it's always, no matter how well it's marked or lined out, or refuge areas or pedestrian islands, I mean, it's always a little bit iffy.
There you go.
From that map, that LiDAR map of priorities for different sidewalks, how much of this ADA stuff touches on multi-use paths, like, the loop path, or any of the other connector paths that would touch something like the loop path?
So this will include anything that's a shared use path. So like, let's say, like the shared use path that runs like along Clinton Parkway, the wider shared use path. But like this doesn't include the loop, the actual kind of loop, because that's actually separate funding, operating funding that they use as part of, I think, Parks and Rec, that maintains kind of the loop. So yes, it includes shared use paths, except kind of the Lawrence Loop around town, but all other shared use paths that run kind of along our arterials, things like that, would include in here.
And all those same rules would apply as far as the same standards if it's a sidewalk or shared use?
Yes, same standards as far as slope. Width is actually different because we actually make our shared use paths wider. So width is different on shared use paths, just because they're kind of allowing transportation from multiple things, whether it be a biker, passing, a wheeled user, things like that. So, so yeah, there's a little bit wider standards for shared use paths.
And that's all built into that budget projection?
Yeah.
So not just the sidewalks, but also?
Yep, so they not only looked at sidewalks, but how much width we would need, or what they were replacing them with, or things like that. So it was all calculated kind of in those initial projections.
And this may not be related, but how do you go about getting a map like that? That's really neat.
You're asking the wrong guy, because I didn't make this map, that's for sure.
GIS.
Yeah, we've got a great GIS team that kind of helps us with all of our maps, and we kind of tell them what we need and what we need it to do, and they're really kind of the masterminds behind it.
Yeah, our asset management group has put together multiple maps, even for just this advisory board. There's the MMTC map out there that you can go find. It'll give you a lot of information. So we've got definitely some great capabilities in-house.
And we hope that when the final ADA transition plan is adopted, we will actually have kind of a live map that can show, like, this is what this is what we're going to do in year one, this is what we're going to do in year two, and kind of can show the different highlighted areas and things like that, because there will be some there will be annual feedback or quarterly feedback, or however they want to see us come back, where we're actually kind of showing them what we've done with the funding and kind of what progress we've made, what barriers we've hit, what challenges we've hit. Are we ahead of pace, or whatever. So,
well, that makes me wonder, as far as how all this gets rolled out. Just like there's a consideration for where people already bike, that's where you would build a bike path, maybe. When prioritizing the funding for ADA compliant sidewalks, are they considering those kind of patterns? Like, let's just say you lived in this neighborhood and you had a wheelchair and you wanted to get there. Where would you go? Because I know we have maps like that we've looked at before with, these are bicycle-friendly pathways that are roads that we know are good. Like, is that factored in? Because it'd be silly if, it's all kind of haphazard, and if I wasn't in a wheelchair, I'd be like, oh, well, here's a forest, I can't go any further. So
Yeah, I think this is probably in the prioritization methodology, that one area that the Lawrence pedestrian plan really does, because they actually use kind of distance to certain things. So like if you were in a neighborhood, how far are you to public transit? You know, whether it be a bus stop, how far are you to, school, things like that. So all those are kind of scored and weighted as well when we're looking at what areas we're going to be in next. So if we know that we have an area that's in really poor condition and it's also really close to a school, it's also really close to city buildings, employment, things like that, that would rank higher on our prioritization map.
Like the citizens look at the most bang for their buck.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, this is informal, but I've seen where they're called desire lines, where people are walking on the side of the right-of-way where there's not sidewalk, but it's worn down, because there's so many, it's like, that's where a lot of users are
sidewalk
using it.
if it was there.
Yeah.
We call them goat paths.
Yeah.
Paths here,
Naismith's a good example of that. Was, because we fixed that one.
Yeah.
How do transit stops factor into this? Because, I mean, Adam and his team are doing a great job of adding amenities wherever possible, but I have a feeling there's probably still quite a few places that just don't have direct concrete access from the sidewalk to the street, which makes loading pretty difficult on a bus.
Yeah, so they actually, on that 2022 bus stop improvement plans, they actually have a really good breakdown of kind of how many shelters, how many boarding and alighting pads. That's what that area that actually connects you from the sidewalk to the bus. There's actually a concrete slab. It's called a boarding and alighting area, which is, again, you can kind of wheel your wheelchair so you're not wheeling across grass or things like that, you can actually go right onto the lift. And they actually have a really good kind of breakdown on how much progress they've made, how much they still want to do, and things like that. So they've done a really good job there.
It sounds like then that's maybe separate from your, I guess, initiative.
No,
is it rolled up into the cost estimate of like how much it's going to take to fix it?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we've highlighted in our ADA transition plan, because there is some overlap. If we know that we're already going to be in an area and we are going to be doing block-in to block-in replacement, and it maybe isn't an area that they either have a bus stop or they are proposing a bus stop, we want to make sure that we are either pouring the concrete at that same time for the boarding and lighting area or things like that. So there's going to be, with this ADA transition plan, there's going to be a lot of overlap with a lot of different projects, because, we may, at any given point, we have a lot of construction going on in town, and so there may be a larger street reconstruction project that is part of that scope, is doing some of the adjacent sidewalks that maybe we were going to do the following year. So we can say, hey, now we don't need to spend funding on that because that's been done, and we can go to a different area. So there's going to be a lot of communication through a lot of different projects and programs to kind of pull a lot of this off.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Any other
I
comments?
wanted to ask a little bit more about the shared use paths that aren't in the public right of way. So you said the Lawrence Loop is not part of the ADA transition plan. Is that because it's not? I mean, just tell us more about why that is the case. It's about 22-mile trail, so.
I think it's just kind of the way it was set up, that it was part of the Parks and Recreation kind of operating budget, so they just continue to maintain that, and the maintenance that needs to be done, is still kind of through that program. Another, consideration is a majority of the, Lawrence Loop doesn't really connect to any of our prioritization areas. It's not really an access point to, shopping, restaurants, employment, schools, things like that. It's more of a recreation path. Now, there's some of it that runs through the city, but it's just kind of the way that it's set up, and just as right now an operating project through Parks and Rec.
Does the federal ADA law require Parks and Rec to maintain it in an ADA compatible way?
The feds don't dictate a department. They say a city. If you have it, you have to maintain it.
So then the city's chosen not to include that in the ADA transition plan? I'm just trying to get clear on, like, why is that excluded from the work that you're doing?
I think I want to reframe it a little bit. So most of the ADA transition plan is to take something that's not compliant and make it compliant.
Okay.
Our Lawrence Loop, for the most part, is compliant, right? We've got some of it's very new. The oldest of it's not even terribly old. So it's the right width, the cross slope and settling issues are what we see on there, and that's why it's more of a maintenance issue. So I think that's kind of why we're thinking of it a little bit separately.
So in 20 years, it might be a part of the plan if it needs more maintenance? I mean,
Yeah, it seems like.
I guess it doesn't seem like it's been
it should be part
accounted
of the
for, and
plan,
that's,
But, I mean, whatever the funding source is, it seems like that should be irrelevant because it's part of the city. Whether it's Parks and Rec or MSO or whatever. And, like Charlie's saying, the horizon in terms of condition, I mean, it may not be in that condition at this point, but at some point, it'll need to have those ADA standards applied to it.
I guess that was my first question is that a requirement that it meets any standard? And then if so, then regardless of whether it needs maintenance now or it needs funding right now, shouldn't it be included in kind of the scope of a plan that addresses ADA compliance?
I would say the reason why we didn't include it in the ADA transition plan is because it already had a funding stream. So it already has Parks and Rec funds that will actually kind of continue to work on maintenance. Now, if there came to a point 15 years from now where they either wanted to, roll that money over into the ADA transition plan or to MSO or whatever, I mean, that would be a conversation above us. So I guess it doesn't really matter how it gets done as long as it gets done, I guess is kind of my theory, whether it's rolled into the ADA transition plan or it's kind of handled by Parks and Rec, unless they're going to roll over that money into the ADA transition plan.
I guess it just sounds then, what you've constructed is more of a funding proposal than a compliance proposal. So if you're trying to provide assurance that as a community, we're ADA compliant or moving toward that, it would seem like it would be inclusive of any of the requirements, and funding would be woven in there separately. If Parks and Rec has funding to maintain that, great.
Yeah, our current, like Jake said, our current Lawrence Loop was built to ADA standards, so it is ADA compliant as we sit, what has been done. So really kind of what we're looking at is maintenance. So even 20 years from now, we're not going back in and addressing ADA accessibility. We may have to do trip hazards or broken panel here or cracks, again, part of kind of a maintenance thing.
It seems like it's almost part of the terminology itself. It's the ADA transition plan. We're trying to get it from non-compliant to compliant rather than maintain what is already compliant.
Just like in the ADA transition plan, we don't have gaps because
Right.
gaps don't exist currently. So
Right.
there isn't current sidewalk that we're taking from non-compliance to compliant. So yeah,
Well, so what I'm hearing though is it was wholesale not included. And part of that Lawrence Loop is more than a decade old. I mean, going back maybe 2 decades.
But it was probably constructed
Part of
to a
it wouldn't
standard
meet
that is-
ADA standards.
It sounds like it probably already is constructed to standard, and if it's not, then it falls under the safe harbor provision, is what I would guess, right?
I guess I'm still thinking that it's such an important asset for the community that it seems like it's just not being included. That seems, I guess it's just disappointing. It feels like there ought to be some assurance to the community that the trail meets the standards. And I know in the discussions early on about that trail, there are parts of it that are clearly not, they're risky for someone in a wheelchair because the slope is excessive. I don't know if it's not cross slope, but the running slope or?
there is some running slope. When we did kind of some testing on there as part of there was another group that I was with and we actually did some rolling of that. So like over by kind of Rock Chalk Park, there are some slope, but again, it's compliant because it's chasing the existing slope. So if it's chasing grade where there already was grade, so again, like if you have some streets or sidewalks that run along some of our hills on campus, if they're running at 15%, you can't have a sidewalk that's 5%. It just doesn't work.
Right.
So you're allowed to kind of match up with kind of existing terrain or street grade. So in this case, like around the Rock Chalk Park, it was matching up with kind of existing terrain. When you're going up a hill and things like that, unless you're going to dig it out and do a tunnel through or 15-foot retaining walls, there's no way to get a straight line through a.
So the existing trail that I'm referring to is not near Rock Chalk Park. It's further south of there, and it's along South Lawrence Traffic Way. That trail was built many years before. The trail that was put in behind Rock Chalk Park or north of it was more recently built, and it was built to be a flatter trail specifically for this reason. It's the other parts of the trail that I think are still, maybe they're compliant in some way, I suppose, but they weren't built with that intention. And that's where it just feels like Parks and Rec is being, in some ways, disregarded in terms of their requirements to comply. And I'm looking for some assurance that, no, that's not the case, that, they're meeting any requirements. In the early days of the Lawrence Loop discussion, that was a significant concern. And it just sounds like nothing's changed, except maybe the newer stuff has had greater consideration for it, but none of the older parts of that trail have.
There was actually a project, again, that I worked on with this group, and we actually worked with Parks and Rec and did kind of this LiDAR around Lawrence Loop. And I actually have, if you remind me, I actually have a map that we developed that has kind of hot spots or higher sloped areas that, based on kind of terrain and things like that, we actually had myself and another gentleman kind of roll a lot of this area. And we kind of spot checked with Parks and Rec were areas that they hooked it up to a gator and kind of did the same LiDAR technology. So areas where we had higher slope that we're going to exceed, we actually have kind of this kind of really cool heat map or user-friendly map that I can get you. It's kind of a really neat project.
But that's not part of this work.
That's not part of this ADA
Yep.
transition plan.
This is just kind of a semantics question. Does the Lawrence Loop in the section where it's not along the street count as public right-of-way? Or does right-of-way only have to deal with cars and utilities? I don't know how that's defined. That may be more of an MSO question, but is that, or not your MSO, of course, but sorry.
I think it's probably site-specific.
Okay.
I have to look at, each one, because obviously we've got, a piece of Lawrence Loop along 29th Street that's within the right-of-way, right?
Right.
But then we've got a lot that's run along K10.
Which I guess is technically a public right-of-way, just not City of Lawrence public right-of-way, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
KDOT
what the
public right-of-way, right?
For that.
Okay. So, I guess, Charlie, I can understand your concerns. I'm trying to see if I can synthesize the information I'm hearing so far to see if I can make sense of it. It sounds like to me all parts of the Lawrence Loop, when they were constructed to what at the time was ADA standards, which means that they are covered under the safe harbor clause of the ADA transition plan requirement, which means technically there isn't anything that's out of compliance right now. It also means that if there's already set aside funding to maintain the loop, through, even if it is through Parks and Rec rather than MSO, that will always be to maintain it to the same standard at which it currently is. So unless there's any major rerouting or like a really severe upgrade to ADA standards, then it's technically compliant as is, right? So transitioning is kind of irrelevant because it doesn't need to transition to anything. It already is what it's got to be.
Unless parts of it need to be reconstructed, which would then mean it needs to come up to ADA standards, which some parts of it.
Okay, so if there's like a
Within the-
big section that's
within
bad.
the- Within the, 20 or 30-year horizon that we're talking about with the ADA plan,
Okay.
likely that will be the case.
I think I see where you're getting at. So like say the South Lawrence Traffic Way part just started crumbling and all of a sudden it's like, okay,
Yeah.
this thing really needs to be, the whole thing has to be fixed. Is that when it would fall under the ADA transition plan? I guess is that
I
where
mean, I guess that, it is kind of what I'm asking, and what I'm hearing is it wouldn't because it's got a separate funding source and a separate department
Yeah.
managing it, and that's what feels a little bit wrong.
Hypothetically, we go 20 years in the future and there's this quarter mile of loop that's really bad and we need to fix it. Then it becomes a capital improvement project. It gets reconstructed to current ADA standards. So it would be separate from a transition plan, and at that point it'd be separate really from a maintenance project because it would be such scale.
Standalone CIP project at that point.
So then that funding would compete for sources in the capital improvement plan with other projects again.
But you're absolutely right. It's a very important asset. And I would find it highly unlikely that there would be major sections that would need reconstruction, that there wasn't some type of funding available for it, whether it be through a standalone CIP project or what have you.
I mean, it's just, if you think about like an asset management plan includes all the assets of the city, no matter what the condition is, but it's projecting in terms of, near term and long term. And so, if I think of this as a asset management, and looking at our assets and where they don't comply and where we need to put our resources, I think that seems like we're leaving out assets as part of this discussion, no matter what the condition, but I don't know, maybe there's rationale that I'm not quite.
So as somebody who's actually worked on an asset management plan as a consultant, you kind of have to draw the boundary somewhere. So for example, for the city I worked with it on, it was only wastewater treatment plant infrastructure, and it was only things over a certain amount of money. So like small sensors weren't involved, but like a pump, if it was big enough, was actually involved, but it didn't include structures, it didn't include, civil works, it was just pumps, stuff like that. And then there would be a different asset management plan that would be just for the conveyance technology, just for the pipes and pump stations, and then like a totally separate one for fleet vehicles. So I think it's like, this is an asset management plan, but it's for public right-of-way sidewalks.
Which is.
Well, and I
Is part of.
should clarify that the Lawrence Loop has been included in the asset management. It's just not in the ADA transition plan. So it's not like it's going unaccounted for. It's just not in our current ADA transition plan draft.
In page 4 of the document for the slides ADA transition plan for right-of-way, it is in the green, so all of the SLT is ADA compliant and part of the 27.4% that is ADA compliant. So that's why it's not part of the program.
And again, that's a caveat. It's compliant to the condition. So if there's terrain there, if you have
Yeah.
existing slope, it's allowed to chase whatever the grade is next to it.
That's interesting.
So then it is in the plan.
No, but it's accounted for, it is.
Okay.
It's on the map, yeah.
Yeah, it's been accounted for on our LiDAR and in our mapping. So the condition of it has been assessed. But the projected funding for it isn't in our transition plan.
Because there's no projected need for funding for it.
It has funding for it right now, under the maintenance program of the Parks and Rec. So it has a funding stream.
And when big projects come up to repair large sections, just like for the ADA transition plan, that will be a separate item under the capital improvement plan. So it'll proceed in a similar way, it sounds like, just different budget, different department.
I think I'm understanding it. Your early slide kind of separated out things that were and weren't in. I think that's maybe where the clarification needs to be added. Things that have their own funding source aren't in the plan. Maybe that would be.
Yeah, and again, like there's projects like the street maintenance program. So we took out any funding for street maintenance program. We didn't include that in the ADA transition plan because that has its own funding stream. But like I said, there may be a large street maintenance project that due to the scope of work, they have to touch adjacent sidewalks or curb ramps. So as part of that, they've done the work that we had kind of projected out in our transition plan that we don't actually have to use for that anymore because it's been handled through another program or another standalone project.
So I think the clarification that helps me is understanding this is not a comprehensive plan addressing all ADA needs in the community. It's a funding plan for what's scoped in this plan. Is that, like, if it's an asset that needs to be ADA compliant, that's not sufficient to be in this plan.
Right, because buildings are assets that need to be ADA compliant, and that's kind of its own thing. Just as an example.
I'm thinking specifically of trails,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it just seems like
Yeah.
because that's funded differently, it's not in this. And that's, still strikes me as an odd choice, but I think I understand the reasoning behind it.
So it sounds to me like the end result is still going to be a positive, right? It's just that the clarification maybe doesn't make sense currently, and that would it be helpful to add language in the plan to indicate like how it's?
I'm not an expert, I don't know what the federal laws are. I
I don't
just
either.
feel like it
I'm just-
seems odd that it would be excluded because it's funded separately.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if I can translate your concern into a feedback. I mean, is that something that could be done? Just add like a clause and say like, hey, by the way, there's a whole bunch of other sidewalks that aren't explicitly mentioned here because of the funding source, but they're covered under the same laws and they're gonna be upgraded. I mean, I honestly don't even know. Is the transition plan like a report document? Like, what does it look like? Is it like the pedestrian plan where there's a lot of text describing what's going
It's
on?
a federal requirement, I
Federal
believe.
requirement.
Yes, similar.
Okay.
That just needs, you know, it's something that needs to be adopted by whatever governing board you have. So in our case, it would be the city commission. So it would be a document that's on record to show this is what we plan to do over this amount of years to at least reduce pedestrian barriers, you know, if not achieve kind of full ADA accessibility.
Okay, so I guess, Charlie, at the risk of putting words in your mouth, would it be fair to say that a feedback would be to try to make it very clear how the breakdown stands between Parks and Rec stuff and MSO stuff, and that like it's all gonna happen. It'll just happen under different funding sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we, on the draft that we will be presenting kind of at a later time, we're still kind of working through a lot of these things where we'll actually break down kind of the different strategies that we can achieve access and different programs
Okay.
and projects that achieve that. Like I said, at any given point, there's so many different projects that are going on that could affect, I mean, we may have a water main break on a corner, and now because of that break, they had to put in brand-new accessible ADA curb ramps because they destroyed what was there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so there's things that kind of happen all the time that can kind of change, and this is gonna be kind of a working, moving target, and we're gonna have to update and reevaluate all the time, because even when we run our prioritization methodology, things may change, schools may close, so now all of a sudden you have an area that scores a little lower, or this may, you know, so I mean, it's gonna be kind of something that we're running all the
Yeah.
time to identify the best spot at any given time.
Okay, any final thoughts, including from folks online? Sorry, I'm not very good at including people on the call because you're like 100 degrees over to my left, so. If not, then we'll, I think we can probably close out this study session, have a quick break, and then come back at 6:15. So, Evan, thank you very much for leading us through this.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Really
It's been
appreciate it.
it's been a
Good
lot of
feedback.
information. It's great.
Yeah.
I think I'm starting to get it.
I didn't want to bring up site plan.
start. We don't, Kurt, are you good to go?
All set.
All right. Christina, you all set? All right. Well, in that case, welcome back, everybody, to the December MMTC meeting. We're now in our regular session. So the first thing is to approve the minutes from the November meeting. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or proposed revisions? And if not, I'll entertain a motion.
I move to approve the minutes from the November 6th meeting.
A second.
Okay. First by Commissioner Collette, second by Commissioner Bryan. All in favor, raise your hand, please. That's unanimous. It unanimously passes, is what I should say. Okay. Next up is public comment, the general public comment. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues that are not scheduled on the regular agenda. Public comment will not be received for staff items, commission items, or calendar. Although, just breaking from the script, we probably could receive some for staff items because it is a significant staff item. So I think for this specific meeting, I think we could bend that rule a little bit. Each person or organization will be limited to 3 minutes. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented at this time. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments to the commission. Is there any general public comment? Not in the room, but online? Okay. Moving on to Part D, regular agenda items. Consider providing feedback on revisions to the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Dustin Smith, Senior Project Engineer with Municipal Services and Operations. And this is our kind of ongoing conversation with the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program and incorporating the feedback we've received in the last few months from neighborhood representatives on the process as well as this body. And so the item, I guess, has kind of a recap of changes that we're proposing to the program, the policy, the process. And again, these were things we've heard from both the MMTC and the public. First one is a revision to the process. We were asked to provide a simplified application process, so we've kind of called that now our statement of interest, which could be from a neighborhood association or individual resident, group of residents, to say, hey, we have this concern. This is the details of the location of the concern and what we think's going on, and then a statement of support, basically kind of a de facto petition. Just get some demonstration of support within the neighborhood along the street to proceed with the project, or at least evaluating the project. And then after we kind of get that initial interest and support, we were asked to also provide some staff support to meet with the stakeholders and help define the project, review data that we might have, and kind of scope the project, including the footprint and the concerns that we identify. And then another kind of lessons learned we've had is to, take that initial data collection and evaluation and evaluate that against our thresholds for when we would, pursue traffic calming, which are in the policy, and make sure that the project is viable before we keep going down that road. And then we've also added defined public engagement steps within the process, both in the attachments, the flow chart, and then the I guess it's called the traffic calming project process. Also spells out some of the public engagement steps, and I guess more kind of bigger picture things that aren't bullet items here is, just really defining the process steps with the flow chart and the and the text, and defining roles and who does those steps, because there was some muddying of the waters with our first attempt in Old West Lawrence. And so I think clearly defining the process and the roles is going to help streamline evaluating and delivering projects. And so then we've also got some revisions to the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program website. Just again, we were asked to, share some of these data sources that we have available so neighborhoods can potentially be looking at those ahead of time, or when we do meet with stakeholders, they know what we're talking about. They can come back to it if they want to. And then we've developed a traffic calming primer that kind of gives a traffic calming 101 that we've talked about of, what are devices that would be considered, and, what do they look like, how much do they cost, and we tried to provide photos of examples within the city. So if you want to go see it in person, you know where to go. And so then this last part of the memo is just kind of our next steps. Tonight we're gathering feedback from MMTC for any additional revisions or comments on the proposed revisions, and then bring it back in early '24 to you guys to recommend approval to the City Commission, and then on to City Commission early '24 so that we can get that first round of statement of interest out to the residents, to the neighborhoods early '24, so we can get started developing projects and hopefully get some design completed and have projects queued up ready for construction in '25 when we get the funding in the '25 program year. So I think that's what I wanted to kind of cover, and then open it up for comments and questions on what we've got with our revised documents.
Well, cool. Thanks very much. And I think in general, this is excellent. I feel like you guys really heard what people were saying at the Your Turn session a while back. What was that, June? Or yeah, it feels like it was quite a few months ago. But there were a lot of concerns that came up. Not all of them were consistent nor necessarily reconcilable between each other. Like, it's too easy, it's too hard, But I feel like you definitely did your best to make it more transparent. It's easier to follow. There's a lower barrier to the application. And also, I think key is that we now have a difference between the full-scale neighborhood pilots and the small street-specific fixes. So we can ideally attack both instead of just one neighborhood at a time for the next 100 years or so.
Yep.
Which I think is a big change. So, yeah. Any comments or questions to start off the discussion?
I have a question on the form for the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program, and under problem location, it has, the first paragraph that talks about exact location or locations of concern within your community. And then the second one about, the second paragraph though then says has options for neighborhood-wide projects or minor projects that could be an individual street or block. So I guess I know that we wanted to encourage or make kinds of projects eligible, right? A single location or a neighborhood, but it's a little bit confusing to me in the wording here as far as I don't know how the second paragraph is different from the first one as far as those different, or maybe that one should be at the beginning, or it's just a little bit confusing, I guess. I mean, I understand what's intended, but someone from the neighborhood might not be clear. Are we just doing single locations, or are we doing an area, or is there some advantage to submitting a proposal for a neighborhood-wide, some that they may not be aware of? So just maybe rewording that a little bit as far as.
Okay. I guess maybe I'll reach out for some input from some of my colleagues, because that was written by me, who's
Yeah.
deep into the weeds, so I can understand.
Well, yeah, and it addresses what we talked about, and, you know, making it this form work for either a single location or a neighborhood, but, you know, just maybe making that a little bit more clear.
Okay.
I see that there's an option for like resident or residents plural or neighborhood association to submit an application. And it has to be from a registered neighborhood association. It's just an example, but I live in a neighborhood that has a registered neighborhood association, but has not been active since 1993. I emailed the contact and she was like, we haven't done anything since the 1993 floods. So, but she, whatever. Anyways, the point was, how do we navigate, or how would residents navigate that potentially with the neighborhood, an inactive neighborhood association, or does it even matter?
That's something we've heard, you know, many times before, and so that's what we're attempting to provide, that option of, if, you know, you may have a neighborhood association, but it's not active, or it's not engaged, or you don't think you'll get support that you would need for a neighborhood-wide project. So then, you know, as an individual, as a group of residents, you know, you can apply as well. And I guess I'm kind of envisioning that you may be able to informally kind of gauge the support and include, you know, those areas that you think, or that you get support, and that'll help define the footprint of the project. But yeah, we're attempting to address that concern of the non-active neighborhood associations.
But I wondered if it would be worth it to put some wording in there that would encourage, you know, if a single resident is submitting it, but just encouragement that they collaborate with, you know, I mean, 2 or 3, or, you know, not just a single, you know, have some communication with someone in the affected area that, you know, that's in their neighborhood, that maybe it's not a neighborhood association, just so that it's, you know, it's not, you know, one person's kind of pet peeve and nobody else cares about it. And, you know, if they have, you know, are encouraged at least, I mean, maybe it wouldn't be a requirement, but just encouraged to get a letter of support from, you know, 2 or 3 other neighbors or people who are in that affected area, that it might strengthen the, you know, the applications that you're getting.
So I think that actually is pretty clear in the flow chart, but it's not so much in the text. So on the flow chart, on the project request, it says you can either have a resident statement of interest and statements of support, or a neighborhood association statement of interest and statements of support. So it kind of gives those 2 options there. Like, you can just be like one person or a small group of people, regardless of your established status, or an association. But then in the text, it says residents or neighborhood associations concerned about traffic safety issues, blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't necessarily say like residents with the support of their neighbors. It just says residents. So I think that may be a bit of a gap in terms of making it clear that you should probably have some support instead of just submitting something without anybody else looking at it. And that gets to a question I had, and that was, is there kind of like a minimum threshold for support? Or are they all judged kind of on their own merits? I'm like, wow, this one's got 10 people, this one has 1 person.
That was something I recognized after this was published, and that's a question for you guys. Should there be a threshold? What do you think a threshold would look like?
Yeah, that's tough.
I think I've seen, you know, definitely majority, like a 60% or a 2/3 majority, but then you got to kind of define, you know, who do you survey?
Yeah, this, what the, yeah, the.
You really want just the
area.
people impacted by it to support it. You know, someone a block over, say yes, but it doesn't impact them.
Yeah, I almost wonder if it's.
No, and it doesn't impact them.
I almost wonder if it could just be like a cover letter for a job application. Like, you don't technically have to have one. Having one's going to help you. A really good one's going to really help you. Use your best judgment. If you really want this to happen, you're going to need some support. So like, I personally would prefer it being more of a suggestion than a threshold. As much as I like metrics and numbers, I don't know if it's as appropriate here simply because there's a huge differential in capability for organizing. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Even if you get 50% of your neighborhood association on, as you found out quickly in Old West Lawrence, doesn't mean the other 50% really is on board at all. So like, how much is enough? You have no idea.
And I guess, I guess kind of baked in the, pursuing the projects is contingent on meeting thresholds for traffic calming. So
Right.
we're
Like there's a
not
point
gonna
system.
go all the way, develop a project that, doesn't meet our criteria.
Right.
Is it possible somewhere in this flow chart, let's just say, I live on a certain block and I really want speed bumps quite badly, and I submit something to the city, and the speed bumps are maybe going to affect the people on my block or in the neighborhood. And if there's something stuck to the door, a door hanger or something with a QR code, even before the city really does any work and expends a lot of time and money, because, the issue with community involvement, I think, is like nobody cares until something's happening. And the problem is by that point, the city probably spent a lot of money and time developing a project and moving it down the road. And that's unfortunate. So I wonder if it's like, I have an issue and here's a little QR code, and go scan this, and just, do you think this is a good idea, yes or no? Because people are inherently lazy until they get mad about something, and then they're not. So it's like, okay, you can be lazy, that's fine, but we're not going to expend a lot of money and time because you're lazy. Does that make sense?
It makes all kinds of sense.
Absolutely.
This is the problem that got us to where we're at.
Yep.
Is in the past, there was a pretty clear set of criteria. Staff would apply it, and then they would bring it to the Traffic Safety Commission for consideration. If it got approved, it goes on a list. So there was, the extent of community engagement was if the person that requested it got the support of a certain percentage of people within so many feet of the proposed traffic calming device. And so you might be right outside of that space, so you don't know about it until it's already scheduled to be built. So there was, then you're already really into the, you spent a lot of money. So buying temporary devices was an attempt to say, how do we get something that starts to get people's attention without being, irreversible, or without spending too much money. But if all you do is give them a postcard saying, hey, we're talking about this, that also might not get their attention. And so you're kind of, how do you get people's attention when something might happen in their neighborhood before you spent too much money? The traffic calming devices that were temporary achieved that goal if it got people's attention. The neighborhood association, I don't know how they tried to engage the public beforehand, but even when staff tries to, it doesn't get the same response as it does when you literally go out and put temporary traffic calming in those areas. So really, I think that's the magic spot we're trying to figure out is, how do you generate enough attention that you get enough input so you don't make a bad, put a lot of time into it or money into it. What I think staff has learned is they shouldn't start this process if in fact it won't even meet the engineering standards around adding in traffic calming, because it leaves the neighborhood or the requester kind of in this place where they think anything's possible. The fact is, not everything's possible. So there's kind of that filter of just engineering expertise. And then there's the challenge of what's the reaction going to be in the neighborhood? How do you solicit enough input early enough that it leads to, a positive outcome? And I don't know there's an easy answer, but this is a little better than it was before. And that's why we're piloting it and now tweaking it. So
I'm thinking about rezoning notices, right? Like if there's a property that's getting rezoned within a certain radii of that property owners get notified, right? They get a
that's how
letter.
it was.
Yeah.
The previous approach was basically like that. X number of feet. I don't remember if it was 300, 200, 100, 400,
Yeah,
but literally, it wasn't very far. In a
yeah,
neighborhood that's, if a street is going to be, if there's going to be traffic calming on this street over here and over here, they weren't part of the request, but they felt the impact of it. So that was part of the challenge of that original model, is it led to impacts in traffic that essentially then disrupted everyone else. And the one street felt happy.
yeah. I think what I was gonna say is like, if we can broaden the radii, perhaps it solves the problem, because once a rezoning goes through, there's no recourse, right? Like, it's been rezoned, the property owner can do what they want with that property at that point. So I don't know if there's a way to do it so that, like, when there's a street that's applying for this, or, you know, the application goes in here, if we change the criteria and the radii in which we notify people so that people are getting notified. I mean, you're right, like,
Maybe.
people get upset once the change is happening, but like I said, if, I'm coming back to that rezoning idea, is like, if it's rezoned, like, people can get upset about it all they want, but the project's moving forward.
So I think what it sounds like then is there may need to be some discretion here in determining how wide the radius actually is, because it's not always clear, right? If you're out in the burbs where everything's a curvilinear, disconnected street grid, one street may affect really far out streets. Like if you put a couple speed bumps here, then like you're going to go way out of your way to wait. They might, right? But then if you're on a tight grid like North Lawrence or East Lawrence, it might not be a very big area of influence. You know, maybe you'll just go one street over, right? And I think it seems like that's built into the flow chart, where at the end of the project scoping phase, staff is basically helping to make the determination, is this a neighborhood scale project or is this a minor project based on all the data that you gather and the people who you talk to? It seems like that's built in. Am I correct in assuming that?
I was actually anticipating that happening even earlier with that initial kind of stakeholder meeting where we define the footprint as, you know, is this going to spill over to the adjacent streets, or is it out where there's not adjacent streets, and so
I
it
see.
can stand alone a little more.
Like define project footprint, probably.
So
is
that's
what
the
you're talking
discretion.
about, right? Yeah,
And it really has to be,
collaborative, right?
yeah, and
Because you guys know more about traffic engineering than the average Joe. So, you know, even if they think, oh, it's only going to slow down traffic on my street, like, hold up. We happen to know that this is a network and we think that's going to affect other people. Let's bring them in, but before you make all your neighbors mad.
and good or bad, we have kind of every kind of type of street layout within our city, so we
Yeah.
really have to use judgment
Yeah.
to help define that.
I mean, as much as I like predictable processes and not leaving room for discretion, I feel like in some cases it is kind of warranted, and it does allow for context sensitivity. But if it's being done in collaboration with the affected neighbors, I feel like that's a good kind of discretion, probably. At least that's just my personal view.
Is that step one that would come to the commission or whatever its future iteration is? Or would it be a staff,
I don't think so.
part of the staff process?
When does it come up?
So I don't know if I'm sharing screen, but yeah, I was intending that part to happen with that initial stakeholder meeting after the request, or the red text of define the project footprint there.
But when that project footprint is, at what point does that become made, when is it made public, I guess? Like, how would a neighborhood know that this project is being evaluated? If they weren't part of the submission group?
It would be in the public survey to identify concerns, refine scope, and set criteria for success. So on the upper, next page, I think.
But the footprint is what's going to determine who gets surveyed.
Right.
So if the survey, if the footprint is, if the public might object to the footprint, thinking that they should be part of it, Is there a way for the public to even be aware that the footprint has been determined?
I guess it depends on how we define public survey. Is this like a Lawrence Listen survey, or is this a targeted one to people within the project area?
That's a good question.
Well, I think that it's like, it's the meetings with stakeholders category. It's like define the project footprint and notify affected areas.
And establish a stakeholder working group, like who is a stakeholder exactly? I mean, at some point, you're going to have to draw a boundary, because I think when it came to the Old West Lawrence pilot, you had a lot of people weighing in who probably didn't live in Old West Lawrence, and were like, hey, man, I can't get as fast through here as I used to. Like, it's tough, right? I mean, it's not your neighborhood, so it's, I think, in some cases, the people who live in a place have a little bit more of a right to determine how safe their streets are than people who use it as cut through. So I feel like it'll be tricky to actually establish that stakeholder working group. But it seems like geography and proximity base is probably the way it's going to go, right? I would assume so.
Yeah. We might consider moving that public survey from that project refinement area up earlier. I don't know if meetings with stakeholders or project evaluation, maybe somewhere in there. Because I do want you guys to avoid, or so we can avoid having you guys get too far down the road with it.
I apologize.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Having slight technical difficulties.
Nobody say anything important. No important things.
So Dustin, how frequently do you get requests from citizens who want an alteration to
Sorry,
the?
Sean.
Hold on.
We have to pause.
Yeah,
because there's no
can we hold that
sound
one?
on
That's an important
It
question.
actually is important.
Oh,
Yeah.
So I want to hold it until Christine.
So we're
gets the stuff
offline
back
right
up.
now.
oh, got it.
You are important, Sean. That doesn't mean you can speak right now. I mean, you can speak, you just have to repeat yourself, so, you know. If you want to practice it.
Technically encounter violation.
Take one.
Probably. Yeah, I think we're technically in
Now
coma
we have a
violation
dance
if we
party, because nobody's
go in here. Man, there's so many important things I want to talk about. Too bad.
My neighbor across the street, he works for Zoom, so anytime I have an issue with Zoom, I text him. I'm
No
like, it's your
way.
fault. It's like, I do technical documentation, leave me alone.
That is a convenient resource.
Yeah.
If only he had proper connections. Yeah. I just enjoy blaming him for everything.
Great.
That is weird. So some people are still in the Zoom meeting. Okay.
Well, it's still on because Kurt's on. There's
Okay.
just no sound for anyone, so.
Oh.
Oh.
Earlier.
Guess we can just email in.
I apologize.
Okay.
All right.
Are we good?
No,
Oh, not yet.
Oh,
She's restarting her computer.
oh.
this is what, I may have to redo the computer completely.
Oh, boy.
There's nothing that a good old reboot won't solve.
Hey, Kurt. If we turn
Technology's
on
gonna
someone
make life
else's
better.
mic, will it work?
I love that line from the McCoy Dynamite film, technology.
I
how I
think,
love thee.
I mean,
So good.
I think this is odd. So you restarted it, right?
Well, it restarted itself, yes. Now it's saying that I can't connect to the audio again.
It's like, well, if you
Yeah, I'm getting audio, but yeah, I'm worried that, I guess we'll find out. Ryan, can you actually hear us?
Ryan, give us a thumbs up if you can hear us.
I don't think you can.
Nope.
Yeah, I do think though that technology, like enabling people to be able to access a computer is a good, you know, it's like I think about, like I have kids, right? And once the pandemic happened, I could go to public meetings and observe them, whereas I couldn't before. 'Cause,
Okay,
you know, the
Ryan,
state,
can you
so
hear us?
still
We got a thumbs up.
Yay.
I hear you.
Okay, I'm just going to ignore this computer.
Ooh, look, there's like an infinite.
All right.
signal.
So we're back? Okay. Sean, you're on. Do you remember what your question was?
No. No, just,
It was something about people applying. to
just
something.
kidding. Okay, so how frequently do you get requests from Lawrence citizens to make a change in traffic calming on their street or their neighborhood or whatever?
So we get requests multiple times a month, you know.
Just roughly like an average, how many a month do you get, you think?
Probably between 1 and like 5 every month, but like, I cage that a little bit with, it's, people are speeding on my street, I need a speed hump in front of my house. Like, not necessarily any data or anything beyond, one vehicle flew by and I'm upset about it, so I call. Like, so a lot of it is that, and, we work our way through those, collecting data to see if there's, actually a concern, and then we've kind of been stockpiling that data to, evaluate with this first round of projects.
I only ask because I wonder, do you have an opportunity as a city staff to actually speak to them on the phone? Is that like part of the process when they
Yeah,
call?
if they do leave contact information, yeah, we try to follow up and get a better understanding of what, where, and talk them through the process of, we're in the process of revising our neighborhood traffic management program, and, the next round of applications will be ready early 2024, and that's kind of what we've been doing in this holding pattern for the last year or so.
Got it.
And I think part of the interesting histories here is that there used to be a process for that back when this was the Traffic Safety Commission, where neighbor associations and individuals would basically like state their grievances and be like, I want a speed bump here. And oftentimes it would be successful, but there was a long list and there was never going to be enough funding to do it. Once we transitioned to the Transportation Commission and now the MMTC, that kind of went away. There was no established process for people to come to the commission necessarily. So instead people would go straight to Dustin or Jake or Dave or whoever to kind of air that. And you guys have been keeping a file of them, of course, but it's probably a huge list. And there's not a convenient way to maybe present that to us, or what do you do about it, right? Every once in a while something comes up and it's so egregious that it becomes a capital project, right? But typically it's like, well, I mean, when we redo that street, we'll get to it, right? So I think it was last year, maybe this year earlier, where there had been some talks with various neighborhood groups of like, how do we get things like, we don't want parking on this street, or we do want parking on the street, and we think this intersection is super gnarly, but it's really just this intersection. And we had even a study session about it, like how do we have almost like a small claims list, right? Because the NTMP solves the issue of the holistic look at entire neighborhoods that maybe have issues everywhere, but it didn't solve the issue of just like one bad street that could fix a whole area if it was addressed. So I feel like this is that solution finally, which is awesome. So we're finally back to the point of having a real process for collecting citizen input and getting it onto a list and evaluating it in a process that is, though discretionary, transparent, which is awesome. So this is something we've envisioned for a while, and here we are, I think. We'll see how it goes.
So I'll just add, I think the challenge is so the neighborhood traffic management program was intended to also think about the entire city and not just become another way to do traffic calming projects. So putting it at the neighborhood level was very intentional. But what we learned is maybe we're missing out on some projects that aren't the entire neighborhood, but they could be really impactful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of saying, how do we bring the pendulum back a little bit so we can recognize smaller level interventions that could be really useful? And then, there's funding now for this project. Years ago, there was a list of 20 approved traffic calming projects with no funding. So even if you resurrected that list, we'd have to figure out, how do we prioritize it? How do we do the community engagement? What's the footprint that it be impacted? Is it the whole neighborhood? Is it half of a neighborhood? As we know, some neighborhoods are really well defined and some are, kind of on paper only. So what's the community engagement look like before we rush in and say, yeah, put a speed hump here and do this here? So that was kind of the idea of buying the temporary devices to be able to do more experimental, engagement. With the idea, looking at, you've probably read articles about communities where they've done this guerrilla traffic kind of planning where they throw things out and see what happens, and then they change it, and then they try again. And so just like, how do we get the tools to be able to do that? Because that makes for better public engagement, gives people a chance to see what does it really look like to do this kind of change before we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this is just an iterative process, I guess, is the way to think about
I
it.
mean, that's the way a lot of our longstanding initiatives have been. They were rolled out by staff, and staff asked for feedback based on performance and our thoughts, and they've been improved based on, additional data over the years, and we're in a much better place than we were 4 or 5 years ago. Like street maintenance is now a 5-year running program. We now have a really great way to prioritize non-motorized projects. Like, things are pretty good, and I feel like this is one of those too. Like, we're kind of just restarting with this kind of small claims list of how can we target, very minor projects on single streets, but it'll improve, and I think it's already starting in a good place. But like all things that involve public engagement, we'll see how it goes in reality, right? Like, this seems like a pretty good idea. I don't see anything wrong with this, but we'll see what what red flags pop up. It's the best you can do.
I see the list of like potential interventions that are, following the report here. Of those, what are the sort of inexpensive, sort of temporary test pilot applications that could be done? Because these look like, permanent
That's a good point.
applications,
I think
so.
all of them have a temporary version except for speed table. I think that's the only one that there is no such plastic device that we have currently. But I think everything else can be done with bollards, and I forget what the little tiny roundabouts were. Was there like a tire in the middle of the road? They were, I'm sure it wasn't maybe a Homer bucket.
bales.
Yeah, I forget what it was. It was little. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all these do have an analog in the temporary plastic realm, right?
I think to your point, though, like, if this is going to be a primer, maybe there needs to be
Picture of them.
education to the public about how we don't just jump in and put these permanent things in place, that we have these other tools so they can test the waters.
Yeah.
That's
And-
good. Yep.
Pictures of those, maybe describing that whole entire phase of the project would be useful, so they know that this is a slow process. We slow down for this work.
So as far as communication with citizens in general with these kinds of projects, this is kind of marketing in a way. And emails are kind of boring, and I'm sure there's certain like Facebook accounts or Instagram accounts that the city runs that are also very boring. I don't know if I'm going to follow, Lawrence Transportation Instagram account. However, I wonder if there's any kind of potential to collaborate with like Unmistakably Lawrence or something to sneak in some real practical, municipal relevant stuff in with their really fun posts about really pretty Christmas lights downtown. I don't know if that's an aspect of this that is considered as you're trying to get just community engagement.
It's one of the E's, right? Education. Yeah, I would assume so. I mean, the city's Facebook account does have pretty regular updates that do include this, in addition to also like the Christmas lights and the horse parade and stuff.
Yeah.
But if you don't follow it, what are you gonna do, right? Tabling has been pretty useful for the MPO and planning department. Do you guys do tabling as well at various events?
We did tabling when we did the big public campaign.
Okay.
Did several events, yeah.
And you're doing it right now for the 14th to 23rd Street thing. So, well, I don't know if that's table. It's more like a town hall open house, but
Kind of open house, yeah.
large table. I do think going to land would probably be helpful. I don't know if you've already had that in your plans, but they're always looking for guest speakers, and a lot of at least some of their more vocal and longtime members came to that Your Turn session, and I'm kind of surprised there's no public comment from them on here at all. So I think
I was, surprised by that as well. And actually, I did go to LAN, way back in 2020, I think, when we were getting ready for the kind of relaunch of the whole program.
yeah.
But yeah, I haven't been back since, so that's a good idea.
Yeah, like I've drafted an email here to land just to kind of say like, hey, by the way, if you didn't see this, like they incorporated almost all of your comments. So you should read it, see what you think, get back to Dustin directly. Hopefully it's all right.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, just to kind of get that going, because I'm sure they'll have comments. There was one, or a couple of technical questions I did have, actually. One of the comments that came up during the Your Turn session was that it costs money to send out mailers and stuff, or even to compensate people for their time to go door knocking. And I forget who raised it, but there's an idea of like, could there be some maybe funding support for neighborhoods who are, transportation disadvantaged or demonstrate some kind of need for, a little bit of help to get people on board? Because that would be a good investment for the city's sake too, right? I mean, if they can do the marketing up front, then that's something that you don't have to do later, hopefully. Obviously, that means more money has to go in the program, but perhaps when this gets pitched to the city next budget cycle, it's like, can we just maybe put $10,000 in here or something for mailers? And I don't know how that would be doled out necessarily. Just, I mean, yeah.
Postcards are cheap. I sent 600 and some to Old West Lawrence.
Yeah.
That's primarily how you guys do it, right? You send out postcards to the neighborhood?
What's it called? Like the every.
We try all the channels, but yeah, it seems like we get kind of mixed results from each channel. None of them really stand out as the most effective, so we still try to hit all of them.
The most effective is having a temporary speed bump in front of your house, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm listening
It does a trick.
You'll get feedback, yeah.
Yep.
Put a sign up, well, you got a postcard.
Yeah.
Yeah, put it,
This is your problem. Check your mail, man. So there's a part of the flow chart that indicates that there is a chance that the engineering or the pilot plan can't actually meet the goals of the stated problem. I'm trying to envision a case that would happen where it's like, sorry, nothing in the engineering literature can help with your problem. It is what it is. It was basically the no route on the flow charts. So the first one is, the project doesn't meet the thresholds for traffic calming treatments. I can see that happening, where it's like, this seems like a problem, trust me, but like compared to other stuff in the city, it's really not that much of a priority. But on the other hand, there's the one where it says, can it be revised to meet the criteria for success? No. Well, that means that either the traffic calming doesn't adequately address the concerns, which is like, can't we just throw more traffic calming at it? Is there ever such a thing as like, you can't throw enough speed bumps at this problem to adequately slow or deter cars? Is that a scenario?
I think speed bumps and speed, I don't think that would apply. I think, they're typically very effective.
Yeah.
But that's more probably with a volume concern where, I mean, just looking back at Old West Lawrence, we did something very restrictive that was very effective,
Yeah.
but not supported at all.
It's almost like the traffic calming will address the concern, but it's not an acceptable solution to the stakeholders.
Yes, and that would hopefully be, identified, or we would not propose a solution that was not supported by the stakeholders because it, potentially was too restrictive like that.
Isn't it also engineering standards in terms of, certain treatments according to the volume on that street and volume and speed, I guess, the two of those. So it's, the stakeholders might still be in favor of it, but if it's got 5 cars a day, then.
Yeah, I saw this as bringing back the standards that were in place with the Traffic Safety Commission. Basically, there would be an evaluation of the request, and if the findings were actually, there's not a speed problem or a volume problem, there's not an issue.
I think that's the previous one where it says, notify the requester that the project does not meet the thresholds. I think that's where that would.
What page are you on?
I'm on the giant one, so 23 out of 210? Or 8 out of 25?
Yeah, 25.
Depending on what sub.
I'm on 8 out of 25, end process,
Yeah, so
notify the
that-
requester.
Yeah, I think that first bullet point is I think what you're talking about,
Yeah.
where like, this doesn't really make any sense. But the second flow chart is when we've actually looked at it, and
Okay.
everything we throw at this still doesn't meet your goal. Or, and maybe clarification is warranted here, like, if the, because it seems like it's unlikely that there's not an engineering solution to it, right? There's always an engineering solution to it. But is the cost okay, and is the consequence okay, right? So I wonder if, like, maybe it's notify stakeholder working group that the traffic calming proposal, I guess, is not acceptable. Like, the only thing that would address the concerns isn't acceptable. It's like, turns out we're more okay with having cars speed down our street than we are having fewer cars on our street. Which could happen.
Is in here the pilot of the devices? Is that what the no is? Like, it turns out the devices didn't actually calm the traffic?
You know? Let's see. Select recommended option, but then do recommended option? Okay, collect data with temporary devices in place.
Yeah.
And then you go down, so it's on the left center. Collect data with temporary devices in place. But then it's only after that if you say, did it work, did it not?
Right, so it's really that the devices didn't achieve the outcome.
Yeah,
That's why you're saying,
Correct.
Don't
Or
proceed.
potentially they're not supported or not feasible.
yeah.
But yeah, because Old West Lawrence, had a goal of, every street 20 miles per hour or less, and that's probably not a realistic goal.
Okay, that would be interesting too, yeah. So I guess there's a whole bunch of reasons for why the no path will continue to be followed. Like, we can address most of it, but we cannot address all of it. That's interesting.
So with this flow chart, though, I mean, what we were just talking about with, the engineering standards as far as volume and speed, is this implying that you would put temporary devices in first and then, I mean, you're evaluating the criteria for success. Let me get back to that. Project meets criteria for success. So is that the point when you're talking about both stakeholders and also the engineering part of it? Because it seems like you would have that information be back here when your additional data collection. And is the question at that point is that does it meet the criteria for success or a project at all, I guess?
Yeah, so this speed and volume thresholds come in the previous step one, the previous page, before we even pursue the project to the step two.
Okay.
But then I think the criteria for success could be, measurables of we reduce speeds this
Okay.
percent, or
I see, okay.
we got our 85th
Gotcha.
percentile speed down to, 27 or those kind of criteria.
Okay, gotcha.
I mean, I guess this isn't maybe personal self-interest, but I wonder, or of the commission, I noticed that the first time the MMTC is engaged, is like after the project eval, if it doesn't meet, like if it's ended there, this is on page 8 of 25, but if it goes to scoping, like proceeds, the MMTC isn't engaged until like public engagement and approval. And, I mean, I don't know, I probably want to know if we were implementing a temporary device or what the status is of the project or for that.
I would agree with that. I was actually thinking even where it comes to the project footprint, like if that's discretionary, would it help to have that, brought here as a way to kind of provide sort of a double check, if the public says, no, that's not the right footprint, it's going to impact me over here and you aren't including me, that kind of thing.
Is this at define project footprint step?
Yeah, I was going further back in terms of the question really being, where does MMTC get engaged? Because engaging MMTC also opens up the public to be able to be invited in, or at least made aware.
I mean, at the risk of overloading staff with, dozens of projects that could come in, I'm personally okay with holding off until the second step, where it's like, okay, now we have a stakeholder working group, and then we can present those options. I don't know. I guess it depends on how many requests you think are going to be coming in. If it's just like a couple a year, yeah, we can handle that, sure. But if it ends up being a lot and this is very well received and popular, then it might be difficult to juggle that. That being said, our agendas have been pretty light this year, so I mean, there's time for it, so.
Well, I think the
can go
part
either
where
way.
there's going to be a temporary installation, that definitely feels like
Yeah,
it ought to be,
is there no touch point before that?
I mean, that's probably the most impactful step, and to have that be made public.
Guess, are you thinking we would need an action item or
Yeah,
like
like
a
here's the
regular agenda item to take action on? Or just
You know,
a staff update at earlier steps?
I would say why not ask for approval to continue, like to move forward?
Could we do it at the end of the step 1 flowchart, where you'd identify the project as a neighborhood or a minor project? And we could say, yeah, sounds good, or I don't know if we think this is the right radius. I mean, it's gonna be our layperson's, assessment versus, people who know how networks work, but it's still helpful, I think.
But it's not just that, it's also the public gets to see, before it
That's
ever
true.
happens,
Yeah,
here's a picture or a diagram
of where.
of what's going to occur. So it's like, here's the tentative proposed intervention, and these temporary devices are going to be installed. It feels like a
Yeah.
good opportunity for preview by the public.
Would we be okay with recommending something at the end of step 1 then? Because there is on the no route, where if things don't work out, and you're like, yeah, it's not worth it, then you report results and conclusions, and I feel like that could be a step
could
item, honestly.
Okay, or, yeah, do
Yes.
both. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
It's same
Either
meeting
now.
at least.
But like on the yes side, that sounds like you're saying, Charlie, that'd be a good opportunity for an agenda item where we could also basically incorporate public engagement at that early step to at least build awareness, because people
Yeah.
won't even know if it's not.
Make sure we've got the right footprint, got the
Yeah.
right stakeholders identified.
That seems appropriate, and I feel like our workload recently has not been super heavy, so I feel like we could add that.
Well, the footprint is earlier, so that's where I was
But
just
there's,
throwing out.
there's room for input at,
To me, that would be less important than, we're about this, there's about to be a change to our streets, even though it's temporary. That one feels like super critical.
So where in the flowchart are you looking at then? Directly after defined project footprint, or?
Where is the part about implement recommended option using temporary devices?
So I was
So
thinking.
prior to that.
I was thinking the sheet above this even.
So I'm imagining, I'm not going to speak for the Journal World or the Lawrence Times, but, this is the moment when they would put it in the paper, hey, this is going to be happening, and it gets people excited. And if they didn't get the postcard, they
Yeah.
might read the news. And then they show up here and say, this is good, this is ridiculous, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
That feels like a pretty good time to,
So if you'll humor me and scroll up a sheet, I think maybe we're on the same page here of doing it earlier. So that final block under the yes route, where we're identifying the project as a neighborhood project or a minor project, I feel like at this point, this is a critical point before it enters the list. Like, okay, it meets thresholds, somebody cares enough to have submitted on it, and we're probably going to define it as a neighborhood or a minor project. But before we get going, let's make sure that we've kind of gone over this flow chart, that we understand the footprint, who are the stakeholders, what are the concerns. And that would be the agenda item, is basically like review step 1 flow chart.
I mean, I would honestly move the defined project footprint down to project scoping. And that's where you engage the MMTC, because that's, does the project meet, engineering thresholds, right? Like, if it doesn't, then it ends there, right? But if it's moving forward, then we can really hone in on, these are the boundaries of the affected footprint. This is what the project scope looks like. This is an opportunity for the wider general public to provide feedback beyond just like the one-on-one meetings with the stakeholders that have already come. I mean, that's where it makes sense to me.
that sounds like it's before you get to see a diagram like we saw with the Old West Lawrence. So I'm not opposed to that, but it just, if we were to prioritize which one is the public, it would be the one where you see, oh, there's going to be this device on in front of my house. I want to come and say yes or no to that.
I don't,
Like that
Because
feels
if you
like
look at, like,
when that happens, before that happens, there ought to be a chance for the public to be aware that that's about to happen. Not just the postcard, but literally create the space for them to come and surface their concern.
It sounds like we're all following on a continuum of project timeline here. So,
Yeah,
Hillary's saying is as soon as we even are defining the project footprint, I'm somewhere in between, like, we know the footprint, but we want to make sure that we're barking up the right tree. And Charlie, you're saying is as long as we get it before the devices are down. Pat, do you have a?
Yeah, well, just on step 2A, where it's project refinement, that's when the stakeholder working group is established, and then that's additional data collection, and then the last one is determine locations and treatment options. So it seems like within that step, at some point, is when maybe it should come to the commission, because that's the point at which they would be talking about the locations that, that we've been discussing as far as, getting attention, so it seems like if it came in at that point, because then then it goes to the recommendations, and so somewhere in between those two seems like is when it should, at least that point coming to MMTC. I mean, maybe there's another point earlier just in terms of general, maybe that's a staff item and this is an action item.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's two different purposes to bringing it here. The one is to bring in people and make it a public notification. The other one is to talk it over and see what makes sense. So maybe the solution here is 2 checkpoints. Sorry, Dustin, I hate to throw this on you, but could we have one somewhere in the step 1 project flowchart where, okay, you guys as staff have generally defined, like, okay, the applicant says it's this street. We think, using our engineering judgment, it's probably the 2 parallel streets next to it also, and this intersection, like, that's our tentative project footprint. Does it meet the thresholds? That's something that you can do administratively. And then, is it going to be a neighborhood project or a minor project? You can also do that administratively, but hold up, there's a gate. Before we go on, let's make sure that everybody's on board with this, and that's the public notification meeting, where it's almost like,
Yeah, staff
call it
item,
public
and it's
hearing.
on the agenda, and,
yeah, it's something that's advertised.
but there's not anything specific about the project really, other
Yeah.
than maybe the scope, and
Yeah.
but nothing else.
And I think the reason that touch point is really important is because it sets us up for the next one, which is establish stakeholder working group, and it should be way easier to establish that if people are coming out of the woodwork already for that first meeting, instead of having them come out later like, nobody told me about this. So I think that is the somebody told you about this first one. And then once we get that stakeholder working group, then we can have a more focused set of people who are working on that second touch point that will happen, like Charlie was saying, right, like as we're determining the locations of treatment options. Does that sound like a reasonable structure?
I got one question, though. It looks like step 2A, so the stuff in red is what staff are going to do. That project selection is a staff item. So page 8 of 25 is really happening before we've even selected a project.
Right.
Do we want to, are you asking that the staff provide in their staff reports all the things that are being considered, or are we waiting to know what they've actually selected in step 2A?
So what I'm envisioning is that once the end of this, the page 8 of 25, once the end of that flowchart has been reached, before it goes on a list, it's about to go on a list, right? It's hit the threshold, it's got support, but before it does, there's going to be an agenda item as a review, and also like a call to participation, essentially.
I agree.
Does that answer your question? I don't know if I actually answered it.
I apologize. I should have given you a kind of overview of, because there are 3 flowcharts. So the first page of the flowchart, step 1, is kind of the weeding out process of
Yeah.
everybody submits everything they're interested in. We
Gosh.
weed through it and see if it meets the volume and speed thresholds before we put more effort into it. But we do meet with them to discuss that data and concerns, and then let them know one way or the other it meets the thresholds or it doesn't. And then at the very end of that first kind of weeding out step, we identify, is it a neighborhood-wide project or a smaller project?
And it goes on a list, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we
That's
would,
a staff item?
Everything up until it goes on the list, basically, right? All that is covered by staff?
No, I'm saying in terms of our agenda.
Oh, no, I think it should be a full-on thing.
So what,
at the end of that, step 1,
Feedback.
approve the identified projects or something
Yeah.
of that nature.
Okay,
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
Approve is strong, but I
So
think it's okay.
project selection is on our agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Like, here's the recommendation from staff.
I think we're gonna have
For
to,
feedback on that recommendation or
yeah.
whatever.
I think we may have to play it by ear. We'll see how it goes. I mean, it may end up being like in city commission where they have so many things to approve that there's a consent agenda, like, okay, this isn't really working, we're getting too far in the weeds. So I think at first, to start off, we should probably bring the first couple that come through to us at the end of this step one flowchart. But then if it starts to be a little bit too much, it's like, okay, people obviously know about this process, we don't really need to have this notification thing anymore, then maybe that can become a staff item instead. Like, hey, just so you know, 4 more projects are on the list and move
Yeah,
on.
that makes sense.
But I think to start, more communication is better than less.
So kind of in the space between step 1 and step 2.
Like, it's basically the decision gate.
The end of step 1.
Yeah.
Beginning of step 2.
And so then moving on to the next 2 pages of the flow chart. So we identify as a neighborhood project. So that's sheet 2 of the flow chart is the neighborhood process. And then sheet 3 is the minor project process. So should have clarified that earlier. Apologize.
I think it's actually pretty clear. I think we've
Yeah,
just been
if you-
focusing on 2A because.
Well, there's
because those are
there's a
next.
lot more there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like kind of what the NTMP was based on originally, but also just logistically, it's the page right next to the one we're talking about, so. Yeah, I think it all makes sense. Do we have anything in minor project flowchart to rethink the footprint if it turns out that the traffic calming devices are having effect beyond the initially studied area? Like, could that be maybe a loop to add? I guess as an engineer myself, we always assume a design basis, and then you do your best, and maybe it's 60%, it turns out, whoops, not quite. There is some new information has come to light, you know? Is everybody else okay with that?
Well, the part I'm a little unclear about is the second box under 2B,
Yeah.
present recommendation for minor traffic calming projects to the Multimodal Transportation Commission. Is that the permanent devices? Because the next step is present that to the city commission.
That is weird.
And then under 2A, the previous page, it says present recommendation for permanent devices to the multimodal. And then the next step is present recommendations for permanent devices to the city commission.
Mm.
So I'm assuming you mean what the multimodal will see is the recommendation for the permanent. And we won't see any, what are the testing I don't know where that's at, I guess.
Well, I
sounds
think
like-
that's why what we were talking about, though, is adding the multimodal MMTC into this step, the second step under project refinement before it went to temporary devices.
So maybe that box needs to be split to have the temporary version and then the,
I think it should be both
Version.
temporary and the permanent ones.
Right.
Because the temporary one is like, that's what all of our meetings were with Old West Lawrence. And so that felt like gives them that safeguard that, hey, before this happens, it's gonna be a public meeting.
so are you saying maybe we should split that step and have a similar kind of feedback loop like there is for 2A?
Just something like that. Because the project evaluation under 2A, it does seem like there's gonna be this iterative
Yeah.
process with temporary devices. 2B, it's less clear that that happens.
Yeah. Dustin, do you think that'd be possible? And I guess at the same time, is there a way that we can kind of limit the amount of iterations so that you're not spinning your wheels forever on one street? Because otherwise that might be unfair to other applicants where it's like, it just never satisfied, right? Like, you know, if after 3 iterations, I don't know, or 2, if the project still cannot meet the criteria for success, then we're going to do our best.
That seems fair.
And that's actually maybe a separate thing. So project completion, on the no route, it says, sorry, it doesn't address the concerns. That's it. But what if it addressed it 80% instead of 100%? Is that still a worthwhile project to do? could that still be a yes, just not as good of a yes?
Are you on 2A?
Yes, yeah, sorry. So like say for the example of Old West Lawrence, if they wanted all the traffic on every single street to be 20 miles an hour, but that just was not feasibly possible, but they could get it on almost all streets.
Yeah.
And if they're okay with that, like, well, okay, it doesn't meet the goals, but there's an understanding that we're going to compromise and do our best based on the pilots that have been done. Currently, the way the flowchart is constructed, it basically is all or nothing. At least that's how it reads to me. So if there's a way to kind of say, well, you meant most of it, you still want a traffic calm. We're not going to let good be the enemy of or perfect be the enemy of good, right?
Yeah, so partially meet criteria would be,
Yeah. It's not the SAT, it's an essay test, right?
yeah, I assume the intent is to try to optimize, right?
Yeah.
To get the most you can without having to do 20 iterations.
Yeah,
So
so,
it's like-
so in order to make that partial credit thing acceptable and to still have the pathway to success, even if you don't meet all the goals, you're gonna have to limit iterations, because otherwise you're always gonna want more and more and more, right? And that's not really realistic either, so. Well, Dustin, I don't know if you want us to dive further in the weeds here, if that's enough to work with for, or visions, if what we're saying is even clear.
I guess my thinking on the minor projects was that,
Less iteration.
you know, they were evaluated against the speed and volume criteria in step one. And with a minor project, it should be pretty, you know, speed was, you know, above the threshold, volume was above the threshold. We put speed bumps in and go, but
I think that's true if the boundary is the street that you're looking at, but I think the issue is if you look at streets around
you have
it
the
in this
spillover and.
place. Sorry.
So a minor project doesn't involve a stakeholder committee? Am I understanding that right?
That's public survey.
There would still be a meeting with the call it applicants and stakeholders, but again, kind of the challenge of identifying stakeholders before you have the footprint.
So, I was just gonna ask, so it was intended that 2B didn't have temporary installations, is that correct?
That was not the intention, no.
That's, I mean, it feels like that's, like 2B is missing a lot of stuff that's already in 2A. And it's feeling a little bit more like 2B is actually the old Traffic Safety Commission protocol.
Yeah. But I think with the lessons learned from the neighborhood traffic management program, we could apply those even to minor projects and make sure that we can mitigate spillover effects and also get the best design for the road without having to go full in on concrete. I mean, honestly, it could almost even be a matter of copy and paste for the most part, just maybe with fewer touch points because it's not as big of a stakeholder group, right? Like you still want to see if it meets the criteria for success, doesn't need to be revised, possibly.
Yeah, I just wonder that if the process is essentially just the same, the only difference is the scoping. Like you scope it at this level or this level.
I think that's okay. I mean, in some cases, the scope really is limited just by the morphology of the road network. But in some cases, you really can't avoid a whole neighborhood issue. And I mean, it depends on the complaint as well, right? If the complaint is cars are speeding everywhere in a neighborhood, like, okay, well, this probably is a neighborhood approach. If it's like 13th Street is a mess, well, probably minor, but we'll see, right? That's my understanding, at least.
Well, it's a process.
Uh-oh.
Damon, you're not talking loud enough.
Just talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Dustin, do you see any issues so far with the stuff that we've suggested? For example, by adding the idea of some iterations or temporary stuff on the smaller projects?
That was my mistake. I missed that.
That's okay. I just wasn't sure if we were trying to ask too much for something that doesn't need to be that intense. So I want to make sure we're on the same page. Okay.
And I did want clarity on where we want the MMTC step on 2A.
Yeah.
I feel like just if there's ever going to be a temporary installation or a permanent installation, each of those warrants a visit here,
Okay.
you know, or if there's a revision and then a change, but that at least provides that space for the public to say,
Yep.
or for us even to point to and say, here, we had a meeting.
So we
Um,
have that in the, when we get to the permanent towards the bottom, but I guess is looking at like in the recommendation step before we do the temporary.
Yeah.
I think so. That
Yep.
would be where I'd want to put it.
So here's a counterpoint. If the stakeholder working group has been established at this stage, assuming it truly does represent the stakeholders involved, the locations and treatment options are generally in their interest and worked through collaboratively between staff and the stakeholders. And then after it's implemented, we can see, did it work, did it not, do we need to go for another round? I feel like that's maybe when MMTC needs to be involved. But if all the other steps have been done so far, and we did get people out of the woodwork during the initial notification agenda item, then hopefully that stakeholder working group is enough to be,
I don't have confidence that
You
that's
don't
going to
know
work.
that.
I
I think that
mean,
when you put the installation, the temporary installation,
Yep.
that's when you'll finally discover who
yep.
is impacted. And so if there's a chance to tell the public, hey, we're considering temporary installation of these devices, they'll suddenly remember how it happened in Old West Lawrence, and they'll get activated and pay attention.
Yep.
so are you thinking of it more serving the purpose of a notification and airing of public grievances thing, or actually us providing feedback like, I think this should be here and this should be here, you know? Are we going to be getting
It's
technical?
both, yeah.
Okay,
Mostly the first,
okay.
because I'm assuming that there's going to be less of the, this should be moved, because I think that's staff's,
Right, that's not our expertise, yeah.
right. It's
Okay.
mostly the fail-safe that, yeah, your stakeholder group is good, but look who we discovered is suddenly interested in this.
Okay, so it
Yeah,
sounds
we-
like then this is erring on the side of caution then, of just
Yeah.
having an additional touch point notification.
Yeah, it feels appropriate if you're going to change something about the streets and don't have any public meeting about it. That seems
Right, so
maybe a bit off.
what about the touch point I proposed for step one, though, where we're already defining what the project area is and that there are going to be temporary things? We don't know what they are, but there are going to be temporary things. Maybe a speed bump, maybe a chicane.
That just feels nebulous to me. When you are the person that lives on the street and you're about to, you get the news that this is going to happen right in front of your, you know, right on your street, you're going to react differently than just when you're hearing, oh, they're going to be messing around in my neighborhood.
So
Like,
do
I'll
we,
just sit back and wait until I know something more substantial. Substantial is a map that shows, you know, 10 feet down from my driveway is the chicane.
so I guess my question is then, does the first meeting that I proposed serve any purpose at all anymore? Or is it just good enough to get people out at the woodwork for that nebulous stage of the project to establish the stakeholder working group to start the next step? Like,
Kind of where I was asking, is that just a staff item? Like,
I mean, how else are you going to establish a stakeholder working group other than just the people who were on the application, right? And I feel like that was one of the flaws in the Old West Lawrence one, is that it wasn't until you had stuff out that you knew who the real stakeholders were, right? Like, you knew who the people who had time and energy to do it, but you didn't know who really cared. And, I mean, I do feel like it is erring on the side of caution of having maybe too many meetings, but maybe just to get us started, right? Like, maybe we do need that first touch point. It's like, this is going to be a project. We don't know what's going on, but imagine Old West Lawrence, but more collaborative, right? People are like, oh, okay, I want to be on that committee. Then you got a stakeholder working group. Then you get that first proposal of where the temporary things are going to be. Then you get that second touch point, and then you get the people who are super, super interested about like, oh, this is 5 feet too close to my driveway. I mean, it's going to be a lot of complaining probably, but it also will get it out of the way first, which is good too.
yeah, I'd say all of them.
Okay,
But
that's where I'm leaning towards.
it's,
Basically having two, so it would
and
be.
if we found out that it doesn't really make a difference, then
Just-
maybe we change it.
Or it'll be quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
be quick. Yeah.
Okay. Is everybody okay with that approach? I know we've kind of been back and forth here, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll see how it goes after the first couple, if it's like, it's too much, too unnecessary. Okay. Did you have any other questions for clarity as we've been bouncing ideas back and forth here?
I guess, yeah, one other thing that I kind of realized after, again, this was published, was maybe a best practice is to put a time limit on the temporary installs so we don't get into I like your word nebulous of, we got to be out for snow removal. Well, it didn't snow, so leave them all winter. Or,
Yeah.
So I've seen, like, I think it was Madison says, we'll put them out for 30 days, collect data and pull them.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so limit not only the time of the pilot, but also, or not only the iterations, but the time as well.
Yep.
Just so there are managed expectations, right? That would be helpful.
I liked it a lot, actually, because I feel like one of the challenges of Old West Lawrence is the more it got deferred, the more they got, almost,
More interested they got.
well, if it's just a quick, we're going to collect data, see what this does, that feels purposeful. When it's just getting drug out, then you start to wonder,
And then
like, what's
there's
really
the
going on.
concerns of, well, you pull them now and
Yep.
speeds are going to go back up. Or
I mean, I guess the question would be, how much of a burden is it to go out and do another iteration to collect more data? Like, is it better to do, like, if you had to do 2 different temporary installations, is that a burden? If that was kind of the max? Like,
I would think we would have the answer of if we're doing another iteration, before we would be ready to, within that 30 days to pull them. So actually, we need to leave this and add to it, or
Should we keep it to 2 iterations right now, just to have a number in there? I feel
it feels fair.
I mean, there was 3 with Old West Lawrence, but that was because things were different. It was all totally a learning experience, right? But now we kind of know you're now building in the collaboration early on. You're making sure stakeholders come out of the woodwork. You're getting the notice out. It'll be presented at MMTC. Like, there are a lot of touch points here. So I feel like the first round will be a lot more close to what people want than it was previously.
but then we still have an opportunity to revise a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
2 max, but not 2 required, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not too
You
required.
can get a do-over.
I mean, ideally, it's 1 and it probably validates, yeah, this will create the success, or meet the success criteria.
I mean, especially for the minor projects, it should be fairly cut and dried. It's just, there may be odd cases, like especially in North Lawrence and East Lawrence, where it's like, well, did it create a spillover effect? I mean, overall, I really like where this is going. This is the best I've felt about engagement and traffic calming like all year, so this is looking really good.
I have another comment, but it's not really directly about this, more about the program.
But you should have the general public comment then.
Well, it's about neighborhood traffic calming, but it's
Okay.
less about this process. So one of the, we've surfaced this before. It's really about, does it serve the community best if we are asking for people to tell us where they see problems? Or is there some way that we're able to detect where efforts should be made, that using other data, where it might point us to neighborhoods that maybe don't have a lot of people organized or paying attention, or maybe even with the time to be able to submit this kind of stuff? And it's kind of like, when we look at larger data like speed or volume, how do we pay attention to the neighborhoods that maybe can't advocate for themselves?
I think it
But,
might be.
we can start to pick up on it from other data, that there's a need to attend to it. And this process still relies on the neighborhood kind of saying, hey, there's a problem. So I'm worried about the quiet neighborhood.
Yeah, who's falling through the cracks, right?
Yeah, the neighborhood that doesn't really get doesn't benefit if it doesn't proactively reach out, or, so I think we've
Yeah.
talked about this before, but
So I immediately
think
thought
as we
of-
keep iterating, for me, that's still a missing element, is how are we
It's an equity issue.
seeing the totality of the community and being able to say, we need to engage this neighborhood because we can see there's problems, even if they're not telling us.
the trick is that crash data is kind of limited to arterials. When I look at the crash data map, they really don't stay in the neighborhoods, and unfortunately, that is the exact opposite of the scope of this initiative, which is really tough. Then, so like, you really do have to rely on like word of mouth, on the ground data, which is really hard because like those are the same people who would bring the issues to you, right? So like,
Yeah.
how do you do that? I agree that it's a huge goal to want to do that if we're going to be tackling equity, but
Well, we talked
Really
a
don't
bit
know how.
about, when we got on the your turn, we talked a little bit about neighborhoods getting more information about what's happening in their neighborhood. And that kind of gets to, how does anyone get more information about all the submissions that go on with the survey tool that you guys use? Which is, it's just, there's ways that people already report issues. I don't know how that gets geotagged and starts to get represented on a map where we could say, all these things, but no one's taken the time to fill out this form.
is that a link we could add to the revisions to the NTMP website? Is there any way to get a printout of the, what is it, see-click fix or the traffic problem thing? I don't know if there's a way to get a public-facing data report of that, but if there is, maybe that would help fill that gap a little bit.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm probably jumping to an easy solution, but like, we do have that information, but like, can we present it?
It's just, how does it get back to neighborhoods or back
Yeah.
even to residents that might, if they saw there was other people raising issues?
Yeah. At the very
It
least
might-
on the NTMP website,
Yeah.
but from there, I don't know. Yeah, tough question. Okay.
I'll have to dig into that and report back, because, yes, I can see a dashboard that has hotspots and every report on one map, but, yeah,
So you do see that?
yes.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of like, where does that feed into this whole process? If you're able to pick up on, there's a lot going on over here, and that neighborhood, no one's organized to do this work. What do we do about that?
I mean, is there any way to have this is getting into dicey territory, but is there any way to have like a prioritized list of the top 5 identified neighborhoods that are high disadvantage, transportation disadvantage score as the priority? Because like that's at least my understanding of equity versus equality, right? Like equality would be a report of everybody. But equity would be a report of the places that you know are probably going to have less ability to organize. So, I mean, I feel like there's probably some legal issues there with like, here are the 5 neighborhoods that might have some disadvantage, but if it helps us meet their needs better, if they don't have the organizing capability, I don't know. I mean,
Or maybe another way to think about it would be if staff just knows that there's a neighborhood that isn't participating in this program, but they would benefit from it, could that be something that staff at least brings attention to, so that we could think about, is that a gap with this project that
yeah.
we need to find maybe a more staff-driven way to elevate improving traffic in that neighborhood that's essentially not suited well for the way we've designed the program.
Sounds like that could almost be automated with the GIS team. I'm sure they could figure out some algorithm to like cross-reference various data sets like, whoa, that's a hotspot. We got to bring this one in here,
I mean,
I guess
that's my
a full
little,
neighborhood project.
yeah, looking at, put Chat GPT to work or something,
I mean, I guess at the very least, would it be worth maybe posting that to the GIS team? And like, is there a way that we can kind of hone in on places that are unlikely to submit an application, but are likely to need traffic calming? Just kind of like an open-ended question, like, Micah, what do you think, right?
I can ask the
smart.
question, but I'm seeing the challenge of we don't have the big data to know what the speed is on every street in town.
Right. I think all you can do is that heat map you were saying of where complaints are coming from. It sounds like that's maybe the only data set that is any
Or
good.
complaints and crashes
Yeah, if there's any
layered together
conflict,
and.
like in the neighborhoods, if there is any crash data for that, which not a lot probably.
I believe all crashes are, mapped, but yet, like you said, on the lower volume streets, there typically aren't a lot of crashes.
And like, there may be tons of near misses and you're never gonna have a way to record those, but like, hopefully the the complaint data could be enough to kind of zero in on that, so, I don't know.
There's not real-time cell phone data on how fast people are driving?
It's available through a service that I think you guys have looked into subscribing to, right? But it's pretty pricey, I think.
Yep.
What's it called? I think it's multiple ones that do it.
There are multiple at this point, but
Yeah.
yeah, they're all still kind of out of our price range, but
Yeah, it's more for like a Kansas City kind of city. I think it's expensive, I think.
Sure.
But
Okay.
something to keep in mind. You know what? I've realized we have not gone to public comment yet. It's probably a good time for that. Is there anybody online who wishes to make a public comment for this? See any raised hands?
Doesn't crash.
Okay.
No, there's not. Did Brian have anything to add?
Yeah, that's a good question too.
Well, we can't hear.
Uh-oh, you're on mute, I think, or something. Working? No. Hmm.
Doesn't seem much for us, it may just be just too big for me. It's our computer.
Okay. Ryan, if you have something to say, if you can at least put it in the chat function. Sorry. I know it's supposed to be a real deal hybrid meeting, but sometimes stuff happens. At least you can hear us. That's a good thing. I'm assuming. Okay.
If we take a break after this one, I'll reboot the computer.
Okay.
Hopefully that fixes all our water today.
Sounds good. Anything else before we close this out? Dustin, did you need any more clarification? I threw a ton at you, so.
no, I think I got the clarity I needed on what I was asking for.
Okay.
Maybe take an opportunity to give you a little update on some of the other pieces of the program that are in process right now, or progress right now. So tomorrow night, we have the bid award for the first phase of Old West Lawrence construction on the city commission agenda, so that's
exciting.
Getting there. Again, the first phase was the speed humps and the chicanes, and then we'll need to wait until we get our 2024 money to bid the traffic circles in phase 2.
Mm-hmm.
But looking to get that started in construction, I don't know, early 24. We did working days on that, so if the weather's nice, they can work and not have a calendar completion date. So hopefully they'll be able to get in and get some work done when we do have nice weather still during the winter. And then I did get a reorder of our yard signs that were very popular with the public outreach program. So not sure if we're going to do a big push to do kind of recreate the engagement that we did a couple of years ago, but we will have them available now because we do get requests for those pretty consistently.
That's interesting. Okay.
So
It's nice that it hasn't really tapered off too much. I feel like once this new thing rolls out, there might be a lot more interest all of a sudden if it's not like I need to get my whole neighborhood or so.
well, and yeah, I'm hoping to have kind of the logistics of how to actually distribute those worked out to where we can kind of tag that on the press releases or the social posts about the new phases of the program.
Yeah. Probably a good idea to proactively get some more of those because, I mean, if my predictions are correct, it looks like this will really increase engagement, hopefully, because it'll allow people who don't have a neighborhood association, which is a lot of people, to finally get into this.
Yep.
Cool. Well, in that case, thank you very much for your work on this. I feel like this has come a long way, and I'm sure it has a long way to go. But right now, it seems really good. Well, I'm all optimistic.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Let's go on to, well, should we have a break so we can reboot the computer? Let's do that. Reboot. And there's not too much left after that. All right, let's come back in. What do you think? 10 minutes? Christina, is that good enough? Okay, sounds good. streets that I think would be helpful to flesh out before we have another one of those existential conversations during the next time we talk about it. So, I guess bike infrastructure discussion? I don't know what you'd call it,
I
but
think if you could narrow it down to biking on streets, that would be really helpful.
there you go.
'Cause I think that's a lot different than just bike infrastructure.
That's true.
And there are
So,
people that want to bike on streets.
yeah,
And I feel like we've kind of moved away from that, saying we're going to prioritize shared use paths and
yeah. Okay, so biking on street discussion, I guess. Because, I mean,
Yeah.
that to me is like the epitome of a study session. It's like a broad topic that we need to wrap our heads around first and try to figure out where we want to go with it and what agenda items could come from it or what longer term initiatives.
I mean,
We want to
another
develop.
biking topic that we know is not well addressed is parking, bike parking.
I'm going to bring this up in commission updates, but there is a lot on bike parking in the new thing of the zoning code, so everybody really needs to read it if you are interested in this stuff, which hopefully you are. So,
Is their public comment still open?
for what?
LDC upcode?
Yeah.
Okay,
mhm.
cool,
Yeah,
thanks.
it's all 400 pages of it are up there. Okay, Jake, is that enough information for calendar? Are we good? Oh, do we need a
Public comment.
Well, I have a
there you
few
go.
questions, real quick. Sure. So I saw that the city commission on the 21st heard this agenda item on the board consolidation, but I don't know how they voted or like what the next steps are. I know that the recommendation was to consolidate us with public transit. Do you guys know what timeline that looks like in 2024 or?
The only thing I've heard from the city manager's office is that they've got to get ordinances in place on how to move all this forward and make the changes, and we were told to expect 60 to 90 days.
Okay.
Are we going to have any self-determination in that? Because when we rebranded from Transportation Commission to Multimodal Transportation Commission, that was like a self-done thing for the most part. That eventually went to City Commission for approval, but we kind of had input to that, if I recall correctly.
Do not know.
Okay. I guess we'll see when we cross that bridge, right?
There wasn't really any input.
For MMTC or for the,
So the Pedestrian Bike Issues Task Force recommended creation of the Transportation Commission, but then it was staff run from that point forward. The first iteration had the different representative groups.
right, at large?
And it was
or-
then a year or so in that was changed to just all at large. So that was the point where.
Yeah, along with the rebranding of calling it multimodal, because we wanted to draw attention to the fact that we're looking at all the modes, almost all the modes.
I believe when it was proposed by staff, they called it multimodal.
Okay.
Transportation Commission.
For some reason, I thought we had a hand in that, but I guess not. I think I just remember talking with Steve about it. Oh, all right, well, I guess we'll see what happens when it comes.
I have just a comment about staff not recommending a retreat at this time, or setting a date for the retreat, and just to make sure that that's a high priority. I think once the two committees or commissions are combined, that we do have a retreat, because
Yeah,
there's going to be a lot to kind of sort out.
it'll be the honeymoon after the wedding, which will be super necessary because we'll need to figure out what it is we do now, and how we do it. Okay.
I assume like an ordinance will tell us like if we reapply or what the steps will be. Okay.
So
Right.
that's how it was before. Like the two committees that were basically dissolved, if those people wanted to apply, they could. But it was it wasn't guaranteed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do need an action to approve it, but first we're going to do public comment. This is one of the very few times where we do take public comment on the calendar because the calendar is an agenda item. So, is there anybody online who wishes to make? Okay. JT. You got 3 minutes.
I stepped away for just a moment and I heard you say that there's you were talking about bike parking in the transportation code.
Is that a question?
The last I heard from you, you don't do bike parking, period. You encouraged me to get involved in the code, but what was it that you said, and has that changed? You know, the BAC used to do bike parking. When the BAC was disintegrated, Charlie can tell you, I've been on bike parking since, how many years, Charlie?
All I can remember.
Okay. And Nick, you said recently we don't do bike parking.
Yeah, it's not really by choice. We just don't do it.
Pardon?
So I'll kind of explain
Excuse
it.
me, what? Why? Why don't you do it?
Same reason that we don't do car parking, because unfortunately, for reasons unknown to me, car parking and bike parking are part of development, which means that they fall under the Planning Commission for citizen things and under planning and development for city staff. So unfortunately, that means even though they very directly relate to transportation, we can't really do much about it. Even when it comes up in a discussion in the Planning Commission, it very, very rarely comes to us for a second opinion. It did once, back in 2019, when the standards were updated, and we did have a lot of input on that. Yes?
Yes, you met in subcommittee, which I asked you not to do. And I'm trying to recall what your input was, because it certainly hasn't been successful. In my 20 years experience, the 23 years experience in biking in Lawrence, bike parking has been systematically and consistently denied, delayed, and degraded. Over that time, start with the Carnegie Building to be quite obvious. When that reopened in 2010, the school rack went over to the Arts Center, not for the public because there was no bike parking for the public. It was for the staff entrance, and I lost a bike there, and I was only in a city commission meeting that was being held there for 20 minutes. I remind you, I've had 9 bikes stolen, and I'm weary of it. Thank you for letting me speak.
So I think you may want to join again for the commission items where I talk about the Land Development Code Steering Committee, because there's going to be really specific actions for what you would want to do to voice your concerns on it. Yeah? Oh, okay. Anyway. All right. Any other public comment on the calendar? All right. In that case, I'm ready for motion, I guess.
I motion to approve the calendar agenda item.
Second.
All right. Motion by Commissioner Carter, second by Commissioner Baltuska. All in favor, raise your hands. Unanimously approved. That's it for agenda items. We're on to staff items. It's kind of a doozy of a staff item, so. But an interesting one.
Aaron Parker is online, and he's going to provide the update on this item.
Hi there, my name is Aaron Parker. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm a senior project engineer for MSO. I'm the project manager for the Massachusetts Street, 14th to 23rd Street Multi-modal Improvements Project. The project is a corridor transportation study and multimodal improvements design analysis that will culminate in a design recommendation. This staff item is a brief introduction and status update for the project and the discussion of next steps. And attached, you'll find the project summary, and that includes all the project information to date. The summary discusses what is being considered in the project and the current status. So please see that project summary for more information. We recently, the city recently held the first public open house for the project, and received ample community input. Feedback is also found in the project summary, so please see that attachment for that information. It's a feedback summary generated by the survey, GIS survey web form. Next steps for the project are to develop concept designs, hold a second public open house to discuss the concept designs, and then go to MMTC to discuss the designs, corridor study, and the public feedback. Following that, we'll have a third open house with a preferred alternative developed with MMTC feedback from the second MMTC meeting, which sounds like might be in another format with a committee. And then go to MMTC with the final preferred alternative developed from the final public feedback and get a recommendation for this design. Then go to City Commission for approval. Design is funded in 2024 And construction is currently unfunded, but this would be an excellent grant candidate of a project. And that's what I had. I'm happy to take any questions based on the attachment or the agenda item description.
Thanks for the update. Any questions or comments from the commission? Okay, I do have kind of a nebulous one, so bear with me here. Sorry, I know it's kind of late. So I don't know how many of you follow strong towns on the regular, but there's an article that came out, I think it was reprinted from somewhere else, and it was kind of an inflammatory title. It's called "Engineers Should Not Design Streets." And what the author clarified is that engineers should definitely be in charge of designing things that are technically important, like stormwater, stormwater sewer capacities and pavement bearing strength and the right concrete mix and stuff like that. But having engineers be entirely in charge of designing streets is akin to having programmers in charge of designing a video game. You get a very technically competent video game that is not super enjoyable because it's not aesthetically pleasing or adapted to the users that it's meant to be for. And I don't think the author really drew a full conclusion from that analogy, but it seemed to me that the extrapolation here is that for streets that are to be lovable instead of just functional, that there needs to be involvement from architects, landscape architects, planners, people who have a direct stake and expertise in the stuff that surrounds the street and not just the pavement that goes on the street. I don't know how I would incorporate that in this particular project, but I do know that this is the epitome of the kind of project that could really use, it's got to look good, right? It's extremely high profile. It's kind of the main street in town. It's an extension of the most popular street in this whole state, probably. The stakes are really high, right? So I guess I don't really know how to reconcile that. I just want to kind of get your thoughts on, Trek is doing the design here, but is there any way that the public can be assured that this isn't just going to be a check the boxes project like, say, Castle Drive was, where it's like, well, technically this meets all the standards, but then it ends up with something that many people aren't very happy with because it just looks like a highway instead. So I don't know. I'm probably being a little bit too pessimistic before I even see a design. I feel like this is something that we've gone through a couple of times where it's like, this definitely looks like a video game that was designed by a programmer and not by a user interface expert,
Do you think that about 23rd Street? East 23rd?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that.
East 19th.
I feel like East 23rd got a lot of positive regard by the community engagement process that was used.
At the time, it was like, okay, this seems good. But honestly, I drive it every other day. Like, it just looks like a regular street again. It doesn't look any different, honestly.
Well, they're not done with it yet.
Yeah. I guess once the trees are in, it might be a little bit different. So I'll hold my judgment until everything's done. It's not that it's not meeting the goals of the project. It still is going to meet the goals, right? But like if you met the goals for nutrition, you would be missing the point of enjoyment of food, right? And I'm saying this as an engineer myself, right? We design things to be functional and to meet the goals, and it's always an afterthought of if it looks good, especially for me because I design wastewater treatment plants. Like, who cares? Nobody's going in there. But roads are very public, especially this particular road. So I don't know. It's not like this project is even funded right now, so it's not like there's a budget concern necessarily. But how do we begin to pivot to the thing of engineers have their specialty, but so do architects and landscape planners and land use planners and stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now we have a number of stakeholders, various city departments and the consultants. We're talking to the city arborist, but we don't have landscape architects. We don't have, we invited planning and development services to some of the initial meetings, but they didn't attend. But maybe planners, as well as, like you said, artists or others. We brought, I did bring economic development and equity program managers into the first meeting, but it was too early at that point to get feedback. But I did envision something like some kind of a sign or a permanent banner or something, or a fixed sign that, welcome, I'm not sure what it would say. I'm relatively new to the city of Lawrence. But I think that is something that we could consider, something like that, but also, like you said, the aesthetics along the revised corridor.
Well, it sounds like you've anticipated my comment in its entirety. So it sounds like you're on the right track. And for this to work, the stakeholders kind of need to play along. And perhaps they might not until there's a concept design. So I guess, I'll continue to hold judgment until things start to happen. But it sounds like, at least from your end, you are making the effort to make sure that it's not just a project by engineers, which is great. So.
Well, it just say does not have a landscape architect involved.
Okay. Well, we're missing one party, but.
Well, that's a pretty important party.
That's true.
When you get into what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think what kind of got me thinking about this again, it all kind of came together, right? Like the article, this project, going to the open house, and then you sent me this very interesting AI generator of what would it look like if your street was Dutch. and the technology needs some working on. It has some really weird things where it splits into two different horizons. AI is freaky. But generally speaking, it's like, would you like Dutch with flowers? Would you like Dutch with markets, or Dutch with tons of bicycles? And it's really cool when you get it to get the right street. My street is not the right street, apparently, but it's pretty cool. And when you look at those concepts, it's like, damn, what if Mass Street looked like that, What if we had flower boxes everywhere and cool trees that overhung things and slip lanes? And I feel like that's something that, it's almost like car design, right? And as much as I'm against car depends, I do love cars. So I do follow a lot of, conceptual design all the way to market. And oftentimes it's a designer who's in charge of the first thing, right? You get this awesome car, the Pontiac Aztec, And then after a couple of iterations, once you realize, the structure needs to be reworked, the aerodynamics are all off, the tires are incorrect. Eventually you get to the real car. But it starts with this beautiful design that captures the imagination of people, or the revulsion of people in the case of the Aztec. But generally speaking, that's how those projects go. And even when it comes to architecture, right? The architects are the artists, the structural engineers make sure it doesn't fall down. I don't know how we work this into it, right? How do we present designs to the public that capture the imagination and aren't just a plan view showing where the trees are going to be, right? I mean, obviously.
Yeah, I think those are great comments. I had two thoughts on that. One is, typically in these concept designs, you see artist renderings of an intersection or maybe just a plan view, but I'm kind of envisioning a three-dimensional drawing or SketchUp drawing of an intersection, but maybe in this corridor we want to have a couple intersections. I don't know, we're not currently scoped to do that.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought was in your Aztec example, that the designer led the way, the artist led the way with the kind of sales side of it, or this would be the most interesting new design. But when it comes to something like a car, it's I see what you're saying. But anyways, kind of the function needs to precede the form needs to, the function is the most thing. But there's also the allure of something. So, but I think to accommodate those things, you might need to engage all stakeholders a little bit more iteratively throughout the project. So I think that's what I see when I hear what you're saying there. So we need folks that are a wide range of stakeholders commenting throughout the project. And that's why we're holding 3 open houses. It's at the consult level of the 4 community engagement levels with MSO. And we want to definitely, our first open house was very successful. We had 72 attendees and just quite a bit of feedback. And then we held an online survey, and we're looking at creating a story map, which is an online display that's very graphically intensive and kind of helps tell the story in a kind of a slick way that any user can gravitate to. So those are things we're looking at doing to really engage the community and make it a successful project. But yes, it's a signature corridor, so it needs this kind of engagement.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
You're on.
Awesome. Does the city work with the university at all? I know that obviously it's really hard to engage students and people generally under the age of 34, but only 2 people under the age of 35 responded to this online survey, which is fairly concerning to me, assuming that that part of Mass Street is what brings people to Lawrence, and our biggest population is our students. So is that something that the city will do, is try to get, maybe the School of Architecture or the engineering school to draw interest from students?
That's a great comment. I really appreciate that comment, actually. And what we did was we put out public notice in general on social media, and then we sent mailers to, I think, a 400-foot buffer on the corridor. So a lot of students live in that area, but also homeowners or, working folks that are past the school stage. And so I think what I observed at the open house was a lot of working class folks, and there's a few business owners that were very outspoken, and people that were there were definitely focused on this thing. And I think they felt like it was a long time coming. I just saw people with their heads down, like pouring out these comments kind of intensely at times. And I didn't see a lot of younger folks, to answer your question, to get back to your question. And I don't know, we had the boards placed along the corridor and social media and the mailers. And I went to some businesses even, and they put them in their windows. And so I'm not sure how much more we could have engaged, but maybe engaging directly with KU, that's something I thought of when you just said that. Like the School of Architecture or maybe even engineering. I am involved with KU on a totally different project, the civil engineering department, for a project that goes right through adjacent to the school, but I think that's a good suggestion. And I did also plan to reach out to KU Transit by way of Lawrence Transit regarding their stops along the corridor. That's something we're doing. Transit's also involved in this. It's a full multimodal study. But thank you. Yeah.
Aaron, sorry, do you want to go first?
Oh, Aaron, I think you already said this earlier, but what is the next step? I know that design is in 2024, and it'll be iterative, but what's coming down the pike?
So right now the consultant is developing concept designs, and we are working with them on that. It's Trek Design firm, and they're primarily waiting on the city arborist to put together a detailed report, because one of the big items that the neighborhood wants to maintain are the existing street trees. That's a big one. It's the second highest valued item of all the items that were on the survey. For kind of multimodal BMPs, we included things like that, retained street trees. So we're waiting for the arborist report to see kind of where the critical and structural root zones are, tree species, diameter and breast height, setback from the back of curb and those kind of parameters, and also from the sidewalk, just to see what we can do with the roadway. We want to do the very best thing that's possible, and that could be reconstruction as opposed to just a resurfacing, restriping, or shared use path. There's a lot of options we're looking at. Several, I should say, not a lot.
So I'll jump in, Aaron. I guess to summarize, the consultant's going to put together some options, bring them back to the public, get feedback again, then come back here to you with those options and public feedback.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So those are kind of the immediate next steps.
Great, thanks, Jake. Better digress.
So I hate to be the one to ever suggest a change order, right? But so I'm kind of thinking of, bringing concepts to the public is typically in a form that they were designed, right? Like the very early stage design is going to be plan view, maybe a couple of cross sections, and it'll be, sort of arted up a little bit so that it's easier to understand. It's not going to be your typical engineering design drawings. But I feel like kind of even in this survey, but also in the, I think it was the pedestrian or the biking plan recently, there was actually a visual preference survey where it's like, what kind of look and feel are you looking for here? Do you want this, like everybody's in the same kind of, suburban house? Do you want this really eclectic mix? Do you want high rises? and people were allowed to kind of indicate their preferences based on how things looked, which is how a lot of people think, especially non-engineers. So, I mean, as a concept artist or a landscape person doing a rendering of what could be, it's hard to do any of that before the preference survey. So that has now kind of been done, right? I mean, with the online survey and the first open house, you basically collected what people's values are, what their favorite parts of the street are, what they don't want to see. I feel like this might be a very cool stage to have like a couple of renderings. And it doesn't even have to be a lot. It could even just be like how a storyboard artist would do something for a movie or a video game. I mean, stuff that is obviously not going to happen exactly as it's drawn, but gives you an idea for how the look and feel of the street's going to be. If there could be an option for visual preference, then I feel like not only would that maybe get the public more interested and buying in early on, but could probably inform what the design eventually looks like to make that concept work within the bounds of METCD. But that costs money.
Right, and what we've shown them is typical measures for multimodal improvement, examples around town or in general. And what you're suggesting is something that is site-specific renderings for showing what some of the options could be, or maybe showing what the 2 or 3 design alternative options would be at one intersection, and then they can make comments. I like this alternative, but maybe a few more trees or benches here by the bus station, shelter, or something like that.
Yeah.
Now that they're seeing it drawn out, they can comment on it.
Yeah, it's kind of like when people are shopping for a home, and it's hard to envision what an empty room is going to look like once all your stuff's in there. So having that kind of like augmented reality can help people who are visual learners see it. I think what you said in terms of having that actual context at the intersection, here's what it looks like, here's what it could look like, that is an awesome way to do it. I do think it's probably the most expensive way to do it too. I wonder if there's maybe a slightly easier way of doing that and showing streets that are of a similar throughput and of a similar importance to a town or a city, and just, like, hey, do we want the Iowa City style? Do we want the Barcelona style? Do we want the Davis, California style? And that could even be enough right there to kind of differentiate between actual aesthetics rather than just saying, I do want street trees, I don't want street trees. Like giving us all enough information to design the street that really is something people can be proud of because they had a bit of a hand in designing it. And I'm wondering if that's a small enough of a change that it could be maybe incorporated without even a change order at all. Like just get a couple of options that are, 3,000 cars a day, and it has to be, here's the right of way width that we have to work with, and from there just choose a couple of potential options maybe.
I think we can, sorry, Aaron, I'm going to jump in again. I think it's definitely an option at our second public meeting to give some visual displays and just ask for preference, and that gets some of that input directly in an easy manner, and it wouldn't be an additional cost that we couldn't bear.
Okay. I mean, as long as that's not too much work, I feel like that's probably the easiest way to do that. Although, now that we're thinking about it, like this maybe is the kind of process that we might want to look into in the future of like, how do we incorporate conceptual design early on before it gets to this point and I'm asking for it, whether it's warranted or not, right? So I think, yeah, I mean, I would definitely appreciate that inclusion if it can be done. And if it ends up being totally useless, well, at least now we know. But I think it might have some value.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, I think so as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for being open-minded. Any other comments or questions from the commission?
This is just an observation. Item number 11 on page 71. It's a long document. The data looks a little whacked out by the cloud here. Just if you're going to release this out, just take a peek at that.
Oh, the date, 07.
Yeah, the date and that.
Yeah, some on the data entry probably got a little weird. That's all.
Thank you. I see that at 7th of November.
Yep.
Right.
Metadata freaked out.
Yeah, metadata. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that's good. Any final thoughts?
I guess one question I'd ask is the scope of work that Trek is doing, would that include site-specific 3D renderings? Or
I'd have to go back and look at that.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Thinking probably not. They have sub-consulted Shockey to do public outreach, web content, and I think they're gathering the multimodal traffic measures, photos of it in other cities or in our city. I don't know that they're doing 3D renderings. We did have to part the scope down a little bit to get it in budget.
Do we have data on how many people walk up and down that segment of Mass? I mean, I think Mass Street is one of the more pedestrian-friendly spaces, and a lot of the comments seem to focus on improving the sidewalks on this southern section of Mass, and I'm just thinking, like, people love to walk on Mass. So out of all the things to do, probably prioritizing making it feel like an enjoyable stroll would be make it kind of an iconic street. There's a lot of comments also about bicycling, but in our discussions before, like the trade-offs between shared use paths and bike lanes and, you know, the lanes for traffic, I'm feeling more inclined from what I'm seeing to think about how does the pedestrian experience get prioritized, which is not what I would have imagined I would think before seeing this data. I was kind of excited, like the idea of a cycle track, but it's like, maybe not. Trees and walking.
Well, you're right, because pedestrians are going to be more excited about trees than cyclists.
Yep.
It's not like cyclists don't like trees, but when you're strolling, you have more time to appreciate trees.
Yep.
The one thing I'll say, though, is the land use is different south on that part of Mass Street. And so the reason you have foot traffic on the northern, north of South Park is because of the commercial components and places that people are going, whereas south of South Park, it's just residential, effectively. And so you'll have dog walkers, right? But I don't know that you're going to have strollers, like people strolling, flaneurs, if you will, like you have north of the park.
Although in the southern part of Mass, you see a lot of foot traffic between the grocery store Dillon's in that area. I live in that part of town, so honestly, I'm kind of team pedestrian on this one. I think that it's surprising to see the feedback from this first survey, but it makes a lot of sense when you see the amount of traffic from like that grocery store and then that corner of what is it? Is it we worked on it. It's where Supersonic Music is and the middle school. That area sees a lot of foot traffic as well.
14th,
yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest with you guys. This is a huge road for what it's really supposed to be. It's 45 feet curb to curb-ish, at least according to my Google Maps handy-dandy measurement tool, which means that you could have 3 10-foot lanes and still have 15 feet left over for bike track and do better with the sidewalks on the end. It is a huge right-of-way. It was probably always meant to be like the wagon trail thoroughfare right through town, right? Like, this is our grand promenade. And it's accordingly gigantic. So, I mean, you could easily have a lane in either direction and a middle turn lane with appropriate trees and medians in the middle. Maybe that's going to happen. I don't know. And then a protected bike lane on either side and a great sidewalk. We could have it all.
And parking?
Probably not. How many people
now, does it?
It does, but nobody uses it. Like, it's officially allowed, but like, how many times have you actually seen parking on Mass Street? Like, it's pretty rare.
I mean, people don't park there because of like the traffic. And
It sure doesn't look like a parking spot, right? Like, but why?
There's certain parts of it where parking's pretty critical.
Sure. I mean, around 14th, and that's about it, I guess. Because everything on 19th has a parking lot. But closer to 14th, it's kind of odd businesses here and there. But I don't know. I'm just saying it. I feel like let's not limit ourselves to just one mode or 2 modes. I think we can do 3 modes maybe.
I agree with you, Nick. I mean, the road is massive, and it's not going to be pleasant to walk down if it's still 45 feet with 4 lanes across the whole thing.
It's a lot harder to drag race down 9-foot lanes.
Yeah.
Although the motorcyclists will do just fine. The cars will have to really work for their drag racing.
We can have it all.
We can have it all. Except for no drag bikes. We're probably still going to have that.
The cycle lane only makes the walking experience better, too. So
Yeah.
they go hand in hand.
Cool. Any other questions? I know we keep opening other doors here, but
Thanks for the feedback.
yeah. Thanks for the presentation. I'm excited to see where this goes. I think most of the city is probably excited to see where this goes. No pressure. Okay. Any other staff items? Jake or Dustin? No?
Nope.
Okay. Commission items it is. Where's my agenda? Who's up first while I navigate back to where I'm supposed to be?
It's climate action plan. They've got, I think, a couple more open houses on the books. If you're interested, go check them out. They're bringing up, well, I guess they'll revisit the draft based on feedback and then be bringing it to City Commission early next year, or spring next year, I'll say.
Cool. And thank you for your tabling at the events as well. I really appreciate the kind of above and beyond participation here, so.
For sure.
It's an example to follow, everybody. Looks like I'm up next. Land Development Code Steering Committee. I don't remember if this came up last time or not, or if we maybe didn't have a meeting, but Module 2 is out. Module 2 is really important. So Module 1 was the uses and districts. So like, where can you do what? But the second module is how do you have to do it? So that's like, how does your parking lot have to look like? What kind of driveways do you need? Let's see, what else? How many trees do you need on the buffer between your use and a different use? How bright can your lights be? What sustainability measures do you need to have on site to meet our goals, right? Like, there's all sorts of stuff in all sorts of fields. It touches on architecture, landscape architecture, transportation quite a bit, sustainability. So the parts that are most important to us are going to be the articles about parking and loading access standards. The big news about parking is that there are no more off-street minimums. That's big. That would make us one of the few cities in the country to have fully eliminated parking minimums off-street. Instead, there are maximums, which is like surprisingly progressive. Not for all uses. There's quite a few uses that get a free pass and can do whatever they want, including car lots and any government businesses. So it's not perfect, but like pretty good step. That was changed actually during the steering committee meeting. Mayor Finkelstein said, well, I mean, if we're gonna, oh no, he's not mayor anymore. He said, if we're gonna have no minimums and only maximums on commercial and industrial, why not do that on residential too? And the consultant said, bold, I like it. All right, let's do it for the draft. So that's the draft that we have. We decided to kind of come out swinging and see what happens, and then if we got to dial it back, then we do. The second part is loading and access standards. So that's something that we reviewed back in probably 2019 with what John was alluding to earlier, but it's kind of back in the public eye. So it's kind of like a whole rewrite of it. So there's a lot of things around how parking spots must look, how wide they must be, the aisles between them, how many, like what the surfaces must be paved with, how much light has to be in there, and there's a lot about bike parking as well. So there are recommendations for exactly what kind of bike racks to use and what not to use. I'm not an expert or advocate in this field, but I feel like some of the stuff they're prohibiting actually works okay, but that's just me. There are actually requirements now for having bike parking inside as well for certain kinds of apartment complexes. There's a distinction between short-term and long-term bike parking spaces, and there are minimums on those versus maximums, so that's kind of interesting. They have to be a certain distance away from the front door. You can't put them like all the way at the edge of the parking lot. They have to be within 50 feet of the front door. In some places, they have to be covered, which is kind of cool. The distinction between short-term and long-term is like, long-term would be for employees or students out of school or people who actually live at an apartment complex, and short-term is just like visitors. So there's like tables for what is required where. So if you have any really nitty-gritty technical comments, this is the time to go in and check it out. I think what else is important. That's about it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that is interesting, but doesn't necessarily touch on our group. So like, how many trees do you have to have between an industrial building and a commercial building? How tall does the wall have to be in between it? Like, there's a lot of silly things that are carryovers from the current code that I think somebody wrote 30 years ago and was like, yeah, that looks good, that we just haven't looked at since then. So like, you have to have a 3-foot wall between certain uses, but you also have to have trees. It's like, so what's the wall doing? Is it helping with visibility? No. Is it helping with sound attenuation? No. So why are we imposing costs on development that don't really need to be imposed? So there's just like tiny technical details all throughout that are pretty interesting if you kind of know what you're looking for. So I would definitely recommend reading through it, even if you only have a passing interest in this stuff. At least the articles that pertain to us, which I think is like 9 and 11. I forget what they are. But parking, access standards.
Nice.
So that's it. I don't know how long it's open for. I don't think they have a deadline on the website. But if you just Google search like Lawrence, Kansas LDC, that'll take you to where you got to go. It's on a special site called Conveyo, which is like their public input thing, and it's got the whole document, and you can add comments, and you can reply to other people's comments, and like do likes or dislikes. It's kind of like a PDF Facebook. So there are also meetings coming up. I don't know when. We may have gone through this already, but I'm gonna look and see. So anyway, lots of stuff going on. I hope to see everybody's comments on the draft if you can. And that's it for me. Who's next?
The wayfinding,
You
there's no update on that. We didn't have a meeting
Okay,
this last period.
easy enough.
No update on Vision Zero. Haven't heard anything yet.
Yeah, still under contract, right? Or going through negotiation?
Maybe, yeah.
I think that's what Dave said last time.
Yeah.
Sounds complicated.
I understand it's probably coming shortly, but I don't, that's just what I heard from Dave last session.
Okay. This is probably the one I'm most excited about, so I really hope it gets through, because it's gonna like
I know.
rewrite the rules on, currently we have the 5Es, right? But like maybe engineering is the most important, it turns out. And I think that's what a lot of what Vision Zero goes into.
Yeah.
So, Lawrence Loop, Ryan, anything going on there?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I'm sick because it's my first big commission update and I'm at home, but that's okay. So the first steering committee meeting happened on November 9th, where they kind of laid out the entire plan. I think the recording of that meeting is on the website and the slide deck is on the website as well. The kind of big updates is that there is an open house on December 13th, which is next Wednesday. That's from 4 to 6 p.m. for anyone to come in and talk to staff and then the consultants about the project and to kind of go through what the steering committee talked about last month. Kind of an update to the commission. I think right now we're in phase 1, which is their community engagement and concept design phase. Also kind of exploring the idea of the RAISE grant and kind of the process of what it takes. I think that's the main funding mechanism for it. Definitely recommend the commission attend go to the meeting next week. I'll be there too. The concept designs are really crazy for this. I'm really excited about this project. I think there's so much potential with it. But I'm excited to hear what the community has to say next week. That's kind of the big update there.
Okay. It's I think just to remind everybody and myself especially, this is what started as, I think, Riverfront and Center or Cobb River Commons or whatever it's called. Like one of our former commissioners, Steve, this is kind of his new project after leaving the MMTC. And it's kind of morphed into this huge initiative of like multiple bridges and tunnels and all sorts of stuff. Is the phase you guys are working on just the portion where you're completing the Lawrence Loop essentially, or are you getting to the further out crazy stuff like going across the river?
I believe the first phase is completing the loop. I think I think it's difficult to say kind of exactly where, because it's really dependent on the amount of funding, if I remember correctly. And Jake, feel free to chime in too.
Yeah, Ryan, I can jump in and help you out a little bit here. So, like Ryan did give a great update, first of all, but the RAISE grant is kind of the culmination of this first phase of work, and in that RAISE grant, it's going to be like a holistic, comprehensive solution to everything going on down on here. But the first phase of that would be that direct connection to the loop.
Right.
Now, there's other ideas of getting across the river and the railroad and 6th Street. They'll be part of that RAISE grant application, but wouldn't be the first phase.
Okay. Is this the one where the options were like go in behind the Riverfront Plaza or through it or something? Like, is that the stage that we're at?
No, I think we're kind of past that because we explored that option in past studies and, have written off the feasibility of some of those.
Okay. So is it going to be more like going under the bridge roads or something?
Yeah, potentially.
That horseshoe path? Okay. Cool. I mean, anything to fix the path around there would be great. So, okay. Thanks for the update. Any other not on the agenda commission items that people just want to bring up?
It's been fun.
That's right. This is somebody's last meeting here.
Oh.
Charlie's been on since
Last meeting.
Since the beginning.
like 3 iterations of this
Yeah.
commission. And now you're joining another board, which is a significantly more work, probably.
Which
Sorry.
board are you joining?
Oh, I think he's referring to the shelter.
You're already on it, but
Yeah.
which is a huge commitment. So, but we certainly thank you for your service. Been here for 6 years. How long has this been going on?
7, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
It's been going on for a while.
I mean,
as long as you can
the
legally
bike
do it.
bed task force, so
Yeah.
I think
on there, yeah.
Pat was on there too, so I think it's just, yeah, it's time to get one more night free of my calendar.
I think that officially will make me the most continuously senior member on the commission, which is nuts.
Yeah.
'Cause, yeah, I haven't been in Lawrence that long either. So,
How long have you been on it?
I moved to Lawrence in 2017, and I was on this by like late 2018, I think, and I'm here ever since.
Charlie, our institutional knowledge.
I think Nick's got it.
Yeah.
Pat's
Michael Allman's
some.
got it once
I
he
mean, you
starts
guys are
coming to meetings
growing.
again.
You guys are doing great. I honestly say, just coming in tonight and everybody being here, Ryan joining remotely, it just feels good. Like, this feels like a good time to step aside. And,
It's gonna get really interesting soon.
yeah. Well, and then who knows what'll happen with creating a new committee and
That's what I mean.
how many folks are going to be appointed that, from the previous committees.
Yeah,
So,
should be interesting. Don't worry, we'll keep you in the loop, or you can just watch the videos.
Yeah.
We expect to see you at least occasionally for public comment.
oh, I don't know. I have to take a pause for a little while.
You might get an email from me. Charlie, what happened here?
Yeah.
So our final thing is, oh wait, sorry, were there any other commission items before I scooch on it? I figured that was a good way to end it, but just in case. No? Okay. So the final one is the calendar, which I feel like we've already covered. Jake, is there anything else we need to do about this? Other than just have the agenda planning meeting that we usually do, right? Yeah. January's often canceled. So if it happens, it's gonna be fairly light. It's gonna be electing chair and vice chair. Think about who you want to elect or nominate, or yourself. And then Dustin's going to come back to us, looks like, with the revised traffic management program thing. That's what's on the agenda, at least, so. Okay. So we'll just have to pick a study session. Any top picks for a study session if this meeting happens? Which it is scheduled to. Should we talk about the bike stuff? On-road biking, or is there anything else that was more prescient?
I mean, I'd love to talk about it. I don't know if it's this study session or another. But
You know what? That's probably a good question up front. Who is definitely not going to make it for January? If we're going to have a 3-person study session, it's not worth having what I think is an important discussion. So is anybody not planning on making it for January? Obviously, but who else?
I might tune in.
I should be there the 8th.
Everybody else there?
January 8th.
Let's tentatively schedule it then. Get as many people here as we can and talk about it. I think if I can reach out to Michael Allman and maybe Chris Tilden and see, if there's any flat representatives who might be interested as well. Get the bike people here. We do have a lot of bike people already here. I mean, you four are very, very bike-oriented people. I'm working on it. But let's do that. And we can talk more on the agenda meeting, but it sounds like we have a slate ready to go. All right. If there's nothing else, all in favor of adjourning,
Aye.
say aye.
Aye.
And we're done. Thanks, Charlie. See you all next year.
Yeah.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye, Ryan. David Hamby might be interesting, but if you're trying to bring some other folks.
For a study session? Who's David Hammy?